He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, one long, contemptuous sweep from the top of her travel-worn bonnet down to her dusty boots. And then he turned his back. Harlan Croft, the wealthiest man in Sweetwater County, Wyoming, had just received the woman he'd paid to bring across the country to be his wife. And in the space of a single, silent minute, with a dozen ranch hands watching, he walked back toward his gate, pulled out a folded envelope, and held it out without even facing her. "Give her this," he said to his foreman, "and tell the driver he's not getting paid for this trip." The woman standing beside the battered trunk didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just stood there in the July heat, one hand still resting on her luggage, while the laughter started. Slow at first, then louder, rolling across the yard like a wave that had nowhere to go but over her. Nobody moved to stop it. If you've ever watched someone be humiliated in public and felt your chest tighten because you knew nobody was going to step in, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happens next on that road, what one quiet cowboy decides in the middle of all that cruelty, is the kind of thing that doesn't happen often. But when it does, it changes everything. Well, the stagecoach had been running behind since Laramie. 2 broken spokes outside of Rock River had cost them the better part of a morning, and by the time the driver finally pulled the coach up the long, rutted approach to the Croft estate, the sun was already past its highest point and cooking everything beneath it without mercy. The horses were tired, the passengers were tired, and Rosalie Mercer, who'd been sitting rigid in the corner seat for the last 4 hours trying not to take up too much space, was something beyond tired. She was terrified. She'd been terrified since Kansas City, if she was honest with herself. Before that, even since the morning she'd written the response to the advertisement in the paper, her hand shaking so badly that the first letter came out almost unreadable. She'd rewritten it 3 times. She told herself it was practical, sensible, the kind of decision a woman in her position made when she was 27 years old and had been passed over enough times to understand that waiting was no longer a strategy. Harlan Croft had seemed decent in his letters. That was the word she'd kept coming back to. Decent. He was 44, or a widower, described himself as a man of property and steady temperament who required a capable woman to manage a large household. The letters were businesslike, but not cold. He'd asked about her experience with cooking and livestock. He told her what the Wyoming summers were like, what the winters demanded. He had not asked what she looked like. She'd taken that as a good sign. She understood now, stepping down from the coach onto the packed dirt outside his gate, that she had been foolish to take it as anything at all. The estate was impressive. That was the first thing anyone would notice. A long whitewashed fence running in both directions, a main house that had clearly had money spent on it recently, outbuildings that were neat and well-maintained, a windmill turning slowly in the distance. There were 6 or 7 ranch hands visible in the yard, and they all stopped what they were doing when the coach arrived. Rosalie felt their eyes before she saw their faces. She was used to eyes. What she was not used to, what she had prayed she would never have to be used to, was the specific quality of attention that fell over that yard the moment she climbed down from the coach and reached back for the side of the door to steady herself. It wasn't the kind of attention that came from curiosity. It was the kind that came from judgment that had already been made. She heard one of them say something she didn't catch. She heard another one laugh. She straightened her back. She smoothed the front of her travel dress with one hand, green cotton, her best, worn carefully to avoid wrinkles and now wrinkled anyway from 2 days of sitting. She'd pinned her hair that morning at the last rest stop, which felt like a week ago. She looked, she knew, like a woman at the end of a very long journey. She couldn't help that. She'd done the best she could with what she had. Harlan Croft came out of the house about a minute after the coach stopped. He was tall, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, square-jawed, the kind of man who knew he looked the way he looked and had arranged his whole life around that fact. He had his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, and he walked with the unhurried confidence of a man crossing his own territory, which was exactly what he was doing. Rosalie watched him come down the porch steps and across the yard, and she made herself stand still, made herself breathe. She thought about the letters: capable, steady, a man of property. He stopped about 10 feet from her. He looked at her. Not the way a person looks at someone they're meeting. The way a man looks at livestock he's considering buying, methodical, starting at the top and moving deliberately down, taking inventory. Rosalie felt the weight of it on her shoulders, her arms, her midsection, her hips. She felt her face go warm. The silence lasted longer than it should have. Then Harlan Croft turned around. Just like that. He turned around, walked back toward the gate, and said something to the heavyset man standing nearest to him. His foreman, Rosalie would later learn. She heard her own name. She heard the word photograph. She heard very clearly the word nothing. The foreman walked over with an envelope. He held it out to her without quite meeting her eyes. "Mr. Croft says to give you this." Rosalie's hands weren't shaking. She noticed that with a distant kind of surprise. She took the envelope, opened it. The letter inside was short, 3 sentences. She read it twice. "The photograph you sent bore no accurate resemblance to your present appearance. I require a woman capable of managing this household, not a burden upon it. I will not be moving forward with this arrangement." She folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in the pocket of her dress. "Ma'am." The stagecoach driver was already back on his seat, gathering the reins. He hadn't even fully gotten down. "I've got a schedule to keep." "I understand," she said. Her own voice surprised her, how steady it was. "I can take you back to Laramie. After that, you're on your own." He paused. "I'll need the return fare." "I don't have return fare." He stared at her. "Then I can't take you." One of the ranch hands laughed. She didn't look to see which one. The laughter was the kind that other laughter joins, and within a few seconds there were 2 or 3 of them going, nothing violent, nothing unusual, just the ordinary sound of men finding something funny that wasn't funny at all. And Rosalie stood in the middle of it with her battered trunk at her feet and the July sun on her shoulders and thought about what she was going to do. She had $11. She was in Sweetwater County, Wyoming, which was not a place she had ever been before. She knew approximately no one. She was going to have to figure something out. She was still working on what that something might be when she heard hoofbeats on the road behind her. Not rushing, just an ordinary horse moving at an ordinary pace. She didn't turn around. She was aware of the rider slowing as he came level with the gate, aware that he had stopped, aware of the quality of silence that settled when the laughter died. "Something wrong here?" The voice was quiet, not aggressive, just a question. "Move on, Maddox," the foreman said. "Nothing to do with you." A pause. "Looks like there's a woman standing in the road with her luggage." "That's right, and she's about to leave." "Where's she going?" "Not your problem." The rider didn't move on. Rosalie could hear the horse shifting its weight, the soft click of a hoof against a stone. She turned around slowly, because she didn't want to, but she was tired of staring at the gate. Cole Maddox was not what she expected, which was nothing, really, since she hadn't expected anything. I was lean in the way of men who work hard for a living rather than men who go hungry, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a face that had spent too much time in the sun and looked honest because of it, rather than despite it. He sat the horse the way people sit in chairs they've been sitting in for years, like it didn't require any thought. He was looking at her, not the way Harlan Croft had looked at her, just looking, like he was trying to figure out what was actually happening. "You're a mail-order bride?" he said. It shouldn't have embarrassed her. It was just a fact. "I was supposed to be," she said. He glanced at the gate, at Croft's men, at her trunk. His jaw tightened very slightly, the kind of expression a person makes when they've done the arithmetic and arrived at a number they didn't like. "He turned you away." "Yes." "For—" He stopped himself. "For looking the way I look," she said. She said it flat. She wasn't going to dress it up. Cole Maddox was quiet for a moment. His horse flicked an ear. Over by the fence, one of Croft's men said something under his breath and another one snorted. "Where are you from?" Cole asked. "Ohio, Cincinnati." "You have money to get back?" "No." "You know anyone out here?" "No." He nodded slowly, like none of this was particularly surprising to him, which she found strange. He swung down from the horse, not dramatically, just efficiently, and walked toward her trunk. "I'll get this." "Excuse me?" she said. "Your trunk. I'll put it on my horse. You can ride behind me or walk alongside, your choice. But either way, I'm not leaving you on this road." Rosalie stared at him. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. He crouched and got a grip on the trunk. It was heavy enough that his expression changed slightly when he lifted it. He managed. But I know what's happening here, and I'm not going to ride past it. My name is Cole Maddox. I've got a ranch about 2 miles west of here. It's not impressive. The house is small, the cattle operation is struggling, and I eat the same thing for breakfast 4 days out of 7 because I'm not much of a cook. He straightened with the trunk and looked at her. But nobody's going to laugh at you there. That I can promise. One of the ranch hands called out from the gate, "You really want to take that on, Maddox? Gonna need a bigger horse." Cole turned his head, just turned it, slowly, and looked at the man who'd spoken. He didn't say anything. The silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. The man looked away first. Cole looked back at Rosalie. "My offer stands," he said. "You don't have to take it, but it's what I've got." Rosalie looked at this man she had never seen before in her life. She looked at the gate behind her, the men still watching, the envelope in her pocket with its 3 precise sentences. She looked down the road in both directions, which stretched out into nothing both ways, flat and relentless, and offering her exactly as many options as she had. She looked back at Cole Maddox. "My name is Rosalie Mercer," she said, "and I'll walk." The 2 miles took longer than they might have. The road was rough, and the sun was uncompromising, and Cole matched her pace without comment, leading the horse by the reins with her trunk strapped across the saddle in a way that looked precarious but held. He didn't push conversation on her, which she appreciated more than she knew how to say. She'd had enough of people's voices for one day. What she hadn't expected was that the silence would eventually start to feel companionable rather than awkward. They were about halfway when he said, without any particular lead-up, "The advertisement. Was it his?" "Yes." "What did it say?" She thought about it. That he needed a capable woman to manage a large household. That he was a widower of steady temperament. She paused. That he was looking for a partner, not just a housekeeper. Cole made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "He sent one letter that asked about my cooking," she said. "One that asked about my experience with livestock. He never asked—" She stopped. "What you looked like," Cole finished. "I thought that meant it didn't matter." "It should mean that." "Well," she shifted her attention back to the road. "It didn't." He didn't offer any reassurance. She was grateful for that too. Reassurance from strangers felt like being handed something wet when you were already soaked. Well-intentioned, completely useless. "What are you going to do?" he asked after a while. "I have no idea," she said honestly. "All right." He said it like that was a perfectly reasonable answer. "You can't just take in stranded women," she said. "I'm not taking you in," he said. "I'm offering you somewhere to stay for a few days while you figure out what comes next. There's a difference." "What kind of difference?" "Charity's when I feel sorry for you and want you to be grateful. This is just—" He thought for a moment. "Decency. Basic decency. You're a person and you've been treated badly and I've got a spare room. That's all this is." Rosalie looked at him sideways. Men who said simple things and meant them exactly were not, in her experience, common. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. The word came out with a particular flatness that told on her. She'd used Croft's language without meaning to. Cole's expression shifted slightly. "You're not a burden. You're a person. And if you've got any useful skills, which I suspect you do since you signed on to run somebody's household, you'll earn your place plenty fast enough. I'm not going to pretend I run a smooth operation out there. I don't. I need help. Just maybe not the kind I was expecting to find today." That surprised a short, involuntary sound out of her. Not quite a laugh. Close enough. "Was that funny?" he asked. He didn't seem offended, just curious. "A little," she admitted. "I didn't expect to be recruited while standing in the middle of a road." "Neither did I," he said. "So we're even." The ranch came into view around a bend, and Cole had not been wrong about its impressiveness, or lack thereof. The main house was small. Properly small. 2 rooms she could count from the outside, plus what she assumed was a lean-to kitchen addition that had been built in a hurry and looked it. The barn was larger than the house, which told her something about priorities. There were fences that needed attention. The garden plot she could see at the side of the house was half dead, the plants leggy and heat-stressed and neglected. The yard was clean enough, but had the particular emptiness of a place where one person had been trying to do too many things alone for too long. 2 ranch hands came out of the barn when they heard the horse. One of them was young, Couldn't have been more than 20, loose-jointed and freckled. The other was older, Mexican, with a gray-streaked mustache and the careful eyes of a man who took stock of situations quietly. "Boss," the older one said. His gaze went to Rosalie, then the trunk, then back to Cole. He asked no questions. "This is Rosalie Mercer," Cole said. "She's going to be staying with us for a spell." He looked at both of them. "Treat her accordingly." The younger one, she'd learned he was called Pete, looked at her with the slightly dazzled expression of someone encountering something unexpected and not yet sure how to catalog it. Not cruel, just young. "Yes, sir," Pete said. The older man, whose name was Ernesto, nodded at her with what she recognized as actual courtesy. "Ma'am, I'll see to your trunk." "Thank you," she said. Cole showed her the house. It took approximately 3 minutes. The main room served as kitchen, dining, and sitting room combined, with a fireplace at one end that needed cleaning and a table that had seen better decades. The second room was Cole's bedroom. The lean-to had a narrow cot that was currently being used to store saddle leather and a broken axe handle. Cole cleared it out himself, pulling things into the barn without ceremony, and brought the cot into the main room instead. "I'll sleep out in the barn," he said. "It's summer. I've slept in worse." "This is your house," Rosalie said, "and you're my guest. So—" He shrugged like the logic was obvious. "Do you need anything before I go back out?" She looked at the kitchen end of the room, at the cold fireplace, at the shelves, which held a fairly serious collection of dried goods, but had clearly not seen any organizational thought in quite some time, at the pot hanging over the cold fireplace that had residue in it that she was not going to look at too closely. "Is there a water supply close?" she asked. "Well pump, 20 yards from the door." He watched her looking at the kitchen. "What?" "Nothing." She turned around. "What time do your men eat?" 6, usually. Why?" "What were you planning to feed them?" A pause. "I hadn't fully thought that through today," he said. "Go back to work," she said. "I'll have something ready by 6. He stood there for a moment, looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. It wasn't pity, wasn't skepticism exactly. Something more like reassessment, like he was revising a calculation. "You sure?" he said. "Mr. Maddox, I have spent the last 2 days sitting still. I would very much like to do something useful." He nodded. "I'll be in the east pasture." And he left. Rosalie stood alone in the kitchen, end of the main room for a moment, listening to his footsteps cross the porch and descend the 2 steps into the yard. Then she looked at the shelves. She looked at the fireplace. She looked at the pot with the suspicious residue. She rolled up her sleeves. It took her 20 minutes to clean the pot and figure out what she had to work with. Another 10 to understand the particular idiosyncrasies of the fireplace, which had a flue that didn't draw properly and required a specific angle of adjustment to stop smoking into the room rather than out of the chimney. She worked it out by trial and a considerable amount of cursing under her breath. By 4:30, she had cornbread in the cast iron and a proper beef stew going. The dried beans she'd found needed more time than she had, so she'd set them aside for tomorrow and used the salt-cured beef she found in the cool box instead, stretching it with root vegetables and dried herbs and enough water and patience to make something out of not quite enough. She also reorganized the shelves while the stew was going, because she couldn't help it. The disorder was bothering her in a way that felt productive to address. She found supplies she hadn't initially seen, a second sack of cornmeal behind the first, a tin of dried apples that she relocated to where she'd actually see it, a jar of something preserved that she sniffed cautiously and determined was probably still good. Pete came to the door at around 5:30. He knocked, which she found endearing. "Ma'am?" He peered in. Is there anything you need?" She looked at him. He was looking at the stove with an expression that had very little self-consciousness in it. "When'd you last eat something that smelled like that?" she asked. "Honestly?" He considered. "Maybe Easter." "Go tell Mr. Maddox supper's ready at 6, she said. "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated. "That's cornbread?" "It will be if you go deliver that message instead of standing here." He went. They came at 6, Cole, Pete, and Ernesto, and they were dusty and tired in the specific way of men who'd been doing hard physical work in July heat. They washed up at the pump outside without being asked, which told her something about the standard Cole held them to. They came in and sat at the table in a way that had the faint quality of uncertainty, like they weren't quite sure what they'd walked into. Then Rosalie put the stew on the table. There was a quality of silence that followed that she recognized. Not the polite silence of people waiting to be served, but the involuntary silence of people whose attention has been completely captured. Ernesto looked at the pot, looked at her, and said something in Spanish under his breath. She didn't catch it. His expression was respectful. Cole served himself last. He tasted it, just a spoonful, because he wasn't the kind of man who made production of things. She was already learning. He didn't say anything immediately. Then, "This is good." "Thank you," she said. "The herbs." "I found them on your shelf, the ones in the second row back." "I didn't know I had herbs on my shelf." "You did." She sat down herself. "You also have a flue problem in your fireplace that's going to cause trouble come winter. The damper lever sticks. I've worked out how to adjust it, but you'll want someone to look at the actual mechanism before it gets cold." He looked at her over his spoon. "You figured that out today." "It was in the way of cooking supper." Ernesto made a sound that might have been a laugh. Pete ate with the complete unself-conscious concentration of a young man with a genuine gift for consuming food, and didn't participate in conversation for approximately 12 minutes. After supper, when the men had gone back to the barn, Rosalie washed up alone. Her hands in the wash water, her eyes on the dark window above the basin, she let herself actually feel, what the day had been. The stagecoach. The gate. Harlan Croft's back as he walked away from her. The envelope. The laughter. The road. The 2 miles. Cole Maddox's voice saying, "You're not a burden." She didn't cry. She had cried on the coach, privately, her face turned to the window and her handkerchief pressed against her mouth so none of the other passengers would hear. She'd used up what she had in her. What was left was something harder and less soft. She had $11 and a narrow cot in a stranger's lean-to and no particular plan. She also had, she observed, cooked a better supper than this kitchen had seen in some time. She had found supplies that had been hiding in plain sight. She had solved a flu problem. She had reorganized a shelf system. She wasn't nothing. Whatever Harlan Croft's letter said, she had never been nothing. She pressed that thought flat, like pressing a hot iron to a wrinkle, making it lie straight. She needed it to lie straight. She needed to sleep and think and figure out what came next. The kindness of strangers was not a plan. Cole Maddox was not a plan. He was a man who'd done a decent thing, and she would not make the mistake of building a future on someone else's decency. She'd built enough on someone else's good intentions already. She dried her hands on the cloth by the basin, turned down the lamp, and lay down on the cot in the quiet house, listening to the Wyoming dark. The wind across the plain, something calling far off, the creak of the barn. Bigger than Ohio's dark, more open, like distance had its own sound out here. She pulled the quilt up. It was rough, worn soft by years, smelled faintly of cedar, and she thought about what she could do. She could cook. She knew that much tonight more than she'd known this morning. She could organize, manage supplies, figure out systems. She'd been running her aunt's household since she was 16, and her aunt had been a difficult woman with high standards and very little patience, which had turned out to be, in the end, an education. She had skills, she just needed time to prove it. She didn't know to whom. Not to Cole Maddox, who had offered her nothing she needed to earn. Maybe just to herself. Maybe that was enough. Outside, the Wyoming dark pressed against the window, huge and indifferent, and Rosalie Mercer fell asleep in a stranger's house and dreamed of nothing in particular, which was, all things considered, an improvement on the day she'd had. She was up before the men. That was deliberate. She'd learned it at her aunt's. The advantage of the kitchen in the morning was information. You knew what you had, what you needed, what the day required, before anyone else arrived with their own opinions about it. She was at the fireplace with the flue adjusted properly by 5, water heating on the grate, going through the stores again with her second morning's eyes. Cole appeared at the door at 5:30, stopping short when he saw the lamp already lit and her already moving. "You didn't have to," he started. "I was awake," she said. "Sit down. There's coffee." He sat. There was a pause that she recognized as a man recalibrating to an unexpected situation. She put the coffee in front of him without ceremony and went back to what she was doing, which was taking a proper inventory of the supply situation. "What's wrong?" he said. Nothing's wrong. I'm making a list. She found a pencil stub on the shelf and appropriated it. List of what? What you have and what you need. You're low on salt and you're going to run out of cornmeal inside 2 weeks if I keep cooking the way I was cooking yesterday. You've got plenty of dried beef, but the quality's inconsistent, which probably means you're buying from different sources without a fixed contract. She glanced at him. Am I wrong? He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. No, he said slowly. Then I'm going to need to know who your suppliers are and what you're currently paying. Why? She turned and looked at him directly. Because if you're going to feed 3 men through a Wyoming summer without spending more than you need to, someone needs to pay attention to the supply chain. And since I'm here and apparently the only one doing it, that someone is me. A pause. Lest you object. Cole Maddox looked at her for a long moment. He had a very particular quality of stillness when he was thinking. Not blankness, not absence, but a kind of deliberate holding of attention that she would come to recognize as his way of taking something seriously. I don't object, he said. Good. She turned back to her list. Now, tell me about your cattle operation. How many head, what pastures, what your projected sales look like by fall, he told her. And somewhere in the middle of it, in the flat light of early morning, with the coffee going and the fire drawing properly, and his voice working through the complications of a struggling ranch that needed more hands than it had and more money than it spent, Rosalie Mercer started, very quietly, to understand that the worst day of her life might have dropped her somewhere she could actually be useful. She kept that thought to herself, but she did not dismiss it. 3 days passed, then a week. The work expanded to fill the hours in ways that surprised her only for the first day or two, after which she accepted it the way she'd accepted most hard things, as a problem to be organized into manageable parts. The garden was her first project. What she'd seen from the road on arrival was as bad as she'd assessed. Neglected, heat-stressed, fighting itself for water that wasn't there. She asked Cole about the nearest water source and spent an afternoon working out a more reliable irrigation route from the well to the garden beds, which required moving some rocks and re-angling some channels, work that cost her 2 broken fingernails and a sunburn across both forearms that she addressed with the ointment she found in her trunk. Cole came past while she was still at it and stopped. He looked at the revised channels. He looked at the plants she'd cut back and the ones she'd left. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, that'll work. I know, she said. He left. She heard him tell Ernesto something as he passed the barn, but she couldn't make it out. Ernesto appeared an hour later without being asked and helped her move the larger rocks. He worked quietly, efficiently, and when they were done, he nodded once and went back to his other work. She found, over the following days, that this was how Ernesto operated. He paid attention to things, and if he decided a thing was worth doing, he did it. He'd been with Cole for 4 years, Pete had told her. Followed him from a previous job when Cole struck out on his own. Pete, by contrast, was a talker. He talked while he worked, talked while he ate, talked while he was supposed to be listening to Cole's instructions, and occasionally lost the thread because of it. I was 22 and had grown up in Kansas and had come west because he'd read something that made it sound more exciting than it was. He was genuinely kind in the artless way of young men who haven't had enough disappoint yet to make them careful about it. He asked her, 3 days in, what it had been like on the stagecoach. Long, she said. Were the other passengers nice? Mostly. Did they... He stopped himself, which cost him visible effort. She looked at him. Did they stare? Yes. People stare. She went back to what she was doing. I've been being stared at since I was 14 years old. It's not comfortable, but it doesn't kill you. Pete was quiet for a bit. Then, I'm sorry, that Croft man, the way he... Pete, yeah? If you're going to apologize for things other men did, you'll run out of years. She handed him the tack she'd been mending. This needs to go back in the barn. See that it's hung properly this time. He took it and went, but she saw his expression as he turned. Not chastened, exactly. More like he was working something out. Good. Let him work it out. It was on the 8th day that the first outside trouble arrived. She was in the yard hanging washing when a rider came up the road, not from the direction of Croft's estate, from the other direction, toward town. A woman, sitting straight-backed in the side saddle, with the kind of posture that announced she thought highly of herself at distances of 200 yards. The woman pulled up at the edge of the yard and looked down at Rosalie with an expression of openly entertained surprise. "You must be the Croft woman," she said. Not rudely, just stated, as though Rosalie were an item on a list. "I'm Rosalie Mercer," Rosalie said. Margaret Holloway. My husband owns the spread to the north." She looked at the washing, the garden, the yard. "So it's true. Cole Maddox really did take you in." "He offered me a place to stay," Rosalie said. "I'm earning my keep." Margaret Holloway absorbed this with the slight tilt of a head that meant she found it interesting. She was handsome, in her mid-40s, and had the assurance of a woman who had been the leading female voice in a county for long enough that she no longer thought about it. "People are talking," she said. "I imagine they are," Rosalie said. "It's not. People aren't being unkind, mostly. They're curious." She paused. "Some of them think it's a shame, about Croft." "Some of them were there laughing," Rosalie said pleasantly. A beat. "Yes. Well." Margaret adjusted her reins. "I wanted to see for myself." "And?" "And you're not what I expected." She said it like she was still determining whether that was a good thing. "What did you expect?" The woman considered. "Someone more—" She stopped. "Defeated?" Rosalie offered. Margaret Holloway looked at her steadily for a moment. Then something in her expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to respect. "You're going to be fine," she said, and she turned her horse and rode back the way she'd come. Rosalie went back to hanging washing. Coley appeared from the barn a few minutes later. "Was that Margaret Holloway?" "Yes." "What did she want?" "To see for herself." He leaned against the fence post. "And?" "And I think she went away with her curiosity satisfied." Rosalie smoothed a shirt over the line. "She said people are talking. They were always going to talk." "I know." A pause. "Does it bother you?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "Does it bother you?" he asked instead. She thought about it honestly. "It bothers me the way weather bothers me," she said. "It's there. I can't change it, and I'm not going to stop working because of it." He made a sound she was starting to identify. A low, brief exhale that served the function a word might in another man. An acknowledgement that landed somewhere between agreement and something more like regard. She didn't look at him, but she noticed it. The second week brought a problem that had nothing to do with neighbors or reputation and everything to do with the ranch itself. A section of the east fence had been down long enough that 6 head of cattle had drifted into the neighboring pasture, which belonged to a man named Decker, who was not, Cole explained with the careful understatement of someone being scrupulously fair, the easiest man to deal with. She watched Cole and Ernesto ride out before dawn to deal with it. Pete stayed at the ranch to handle the morning work, which he did with the earnest incompleteness of a young man who meant well and retained about 60% of instructions. By mid-morning, Rosalie had identified 3 additional things that needed attention. The chicken coop roof was losing a board that would let in weather by fall. The cool box drainage wasn't positioned correctly and was going to cause problems when temperatures shifted, and the basic supply accounting Cole was doing, pencil scratches on a scrap of paper pinned above the shelf, was going to get him into trouble with his fall ordering if he didn't switch to a proper ledger. She addressed the chicken coop roof herself with a hammer she found in nails from a coffee tin in the barn. The cool box drainage she flagged for Ernesto when he returned. The ledger she set up on the back pages of a notebook she found with blank pages at the end, starting with what she knew of their current inventory and leaving space for what she'd need Cole to fill in. Cole came back at mid-afternoon, dusty and in an obviously controlled bad mood that she read as the aftermath of dealing with Decker. He stopped when he saw the chicken coop. "You fixed the roof," he said. The board was going. She didn't look up from the ledger. "I also started a proper supply ledger. I need you to tell me what your fall ordering numbers were last year." He came over to the table and looked at what she'd done. He was quiet for a long enough moment that she looked up at him. His expression was complicated in a way she couldn't fully parse. Not displeasure, not surprise exactly. Something that had more weight to it than either. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. I know, she said. "Tell me your fall numbers." He pulled up a chair and told her. Outside, the Wyoming summer went on being hot and indifferent, and requiring of everyone more than they had in them. And in a small, imperfect ranch house, with a sticky flue and a reorganized shelf, and a garden that was slowly, defiantly, beginning to recover, Rosalie Mercer worked herself into the fabric of a place that hadn't known it needed her. And Cole Maddox sat across a table in the afternoon light, answering questions about cattle numbers and feed costs, and did not examine too carefully the feeling that had begun, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, to settle in the vicinity of his chest like a coal bed fire, steady and deep and very, very slow to go out. The ledger became the first real argument. It happened on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Rosalie had arrived, on a morning when the heat came in early and the air had the particular stillness that preceded trouble. She had been working on the supply numbers for 2 days, cross-referencing what Cole had told her against what she could physically count on the shelves, in the barn, in the cool box, and what she'd found didn't add up in a way that bothered her considerably. She waited until after breakfast, when Pete had gone to the east pasture and Ernesto was at the well, before she put the ledger on the table in front of Cole. "You're spending 30% more on feed than you need to," she said, "and your fall cattle sales last year came in under what they should have by about $40. Cole looked at the ledger. He didn't pick it up. "How do you figure that?" "Your feed supplier is charging you above the county rate. I asked Pete what the price per sack was, and then I checked against what Margaret Holloway mentioned in passing last week. Her husband's operation pays 7 cents less per sack on the same grade of oat. Over a season, that's real money." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. "And your fall sales were undercut because you sold too early. You moved the herd before the October buyers came through from the east. If you'd held 2 more weeks, the per-head price would have been higher." He was quiet. "I'm not telling you how to run your ranch," she said, because she could see the set of his jaw. "It sounds like you are," he said. Not angrily, just stating it. "I'm telling you what the numbers say. What you do with it is your business." Cole picked up the ledger then. He looked at it for a long time, not skimming, actually reading what she'd written. She'd kept it precise. No editorializing, just figures and their implications. He set it down. "The feed supplier has been my father's contact since before I took the ranch over," he said. "I understand that. It's not just about price." "I understand that too." She folded her hands on the table. "But the ranch is struggling, Cole. You know it is, and some of it is drought and bad luck and the kind of problems nobody can control. But some of it is this, small bleeds that add up to something large over time." A pause. "I'm not asking you to fire anyone or break a relationship. I'm asking you to consider renegotiating." He looked at her. It was the direct kind of look he gave things when he was taking them seriously, which she'd learned meant he was genuinely listening even if he didn't immediately agree. "You've been here 3 weeks," he said. "I know. And you've already reorganized my kitchen, fixed my chicken coop, sorted out my irrigation, and now you're telling me my business model needs work." She held his gaze. "Would you prefer I hadn't?" A long pause. "No," he said finally. "I wouldn't." He pushed back from the table. "I'll think about the feed supplier. That's all I'm asking." He picked up his hat from the peg by the door. At the threshold, he stopped without turning around. "Rosalie." "Yes." "The numbers on the fall sales. You're right about the timing. I knew it when I did it. I needed the money before winter, and I didn't want to risk holding." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't always make the best calls when I'm scared of what happens if I'm wrong." She hadn't expected that, the honesty of it. The particular vulnerability of a man admitting to fear in a context where men generally didn't. "That's a human thing," she said carefully, "not a failing." He put his hat on and went out into the morning. She sat with the ledger in front of her and thought about what he'd just given her. Not the agreement, but the admission underneath it. Men who told the truth about their fear to a woman they'd known 3 weeks were not common. She'd met plenty of the other kind. She didn't let herself think too much about what that meant. She had work to do. The garden was producing now in the way she'd hoped. Not abundantly, the season was too far gone for that, but steadily. Beans were coming in. The tomato plants she'd pruned back hard had put out new growth that was beginning to set fruit. The herb section she'd established from seeds she'd found in the bottom of a tin on the top shelf was establishing itself in the far corner of the bed. It wasn't enough to feed the ranch through winter, not by a distance. But it was something. It was the beginning of something. She went out to check on it after Cole left, moving slowly down the rows in the early heat, pressing the soil around plants that needed it, pulling anything that was competing where it shouldn't be. There was a satisfaction in this kind of work that she'd forgotten. The direct, clear satisfaction of putting your hands into a problem and feeling it yield. Ernesto came past with a bucket and stopped to watch her for a moment. She didn't look up. "You grow up with a garden?" he asked. "My mother's, in Ohio. She moved to the next plant. She grew everything, sold the surplus at market in summer. It helped." "Your father? Didn't stay?" She said it without bitterness. It was simply a fact that had shaped everything. She managed alone. Ernesto was quiet for a moment. Then, Cole's mother was the same, after his father left. He set the bucket down and crouched to look at the tomato plants. He doesn't talk about it, but it's why he works the way he does. Like if he stops, everything falls. She looked at him. He was examining a leaf with the focused attention of someone who actually knew plants. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He glanced up at her. His eyes were level and without guile. "Because you're asking him to trust differently than he knows how. I thought you should understand why it's hard." She sat back on her heels and looked at him steadily. "You've been watching me." "I watch everything," he said simply. "It's my job." He stood, picked up the bucket. "The tomatoes will do well if the heat holds. Give them more water on the east side. The soil drains faster there." He walked away. She looked at the tomato plants for a long moment. Then she adjusted the watering to the east side, because he was right, and she knew useful information when she heard it regardless of what came attached to it. The rest of the morning she spent mending, not her own things, Cole's. She'd found a pile of shirts in a state of patient neglect behind the bedroom door, things with frayed cuffs and missing buttons, and one with a tear along the side seam that had clearly been in progress for some time. She sat with her needle and the mending basket she'd put together from various salvaged materials and worked through the pile methodically, not because anyone had asked her to, but because it needed doing, and doing it was a way of being useful that cost nothing but time. Pete found her at it around midday and sat across from her uninvited, the way young men sometimes did when they wanted to talk, and hadn't figured out yet that you were supposed to establish whether the other person wanted company first. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to anyway," she said. "Did you, before, in Ohio, were you ever—" He made a frustrated gesture. "Did anyone ever want to court you?" She looked up at him. He was serious, not teasing. "Pete," she said, "that is one of the top 3 most personal questions a person can ask someone they've known a month." He went red. "Sorry, I was wondering, because you're capable, and you're funny sometimes, when you let yourself. And I was wondering why some man hadn't figured that out before." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the shirt she was working on. "There were men who wanted my company. Once or twice. It didn't last. There's a kind of man who can find you good company when there's no one watching and find you inconvenient when there is." Pete absorbed that in silence. "The advertisement," she said more quietly. "Croft's advertisement. The reason I answered it was, I thought that a practical arrangement might work better than a romantic one. Because in practical arrangements, what you bring to the table is what matters. Skills, work capacity, intelligence." She smoothed the seam she'd just closed. "I was wrong about what he thought mattered, but I wasn't wrong about the principle." "Do you think—" Pete started. Then he stopped himself. "What?" "Nothing." He stood up. "I should get back." "Finish the thought," she said. He looked at her uncertainly. He was young enough that his face still showed everything he was thinking. "I was going to say, do you think Cole knows that there's more to notice than just what you're doing?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, wind moved through the yard. "Go back to work, Pete," she said. He went. She put the shirt down for a moment and looked out the window. The prairie stretched away flat and patient in every direction. A hawk was working a thermal to the south, barely moving its wings. She picked up the shirt and went back to work. The town of Mill Haven was about 7 miles east, and Rosalie had not been there yet. Cole went in twice a month for supplies and banking, and on the 4th week she asked if she could come along. He agreed without making a thing of it, which she appreciated. They went on a Tuesday morning, taking the wagon because she had a supply list that required it. She sat up on the bench beside him, which put her at the level of a person rather than walking behind the wagon, and she was aware, in that constant low-level way she was always aware of it, of what they looked like to people they passed. A lean cowboy and a large woman in a green cotton dress. She kept her back straight and her chin level and let people look. Millhaven was not large. It had the character of a town that had been thrown up quickly to serve an immediate need and was now in the process of deciding whether it intended to become something more permanent. Some streets already had proper buildings. Others were still operating out of structures that were really just dressed-up lumber. The general store was solid. The bank looked newer than the surrounding buildings. There was a church and a schoolhouse and a saloon and the usual complement of enterprises required to keep a frontier community functional. People noticed them. She'd expected that. She hadn't quite expected the specific quality of attention, the way conversations paused when they walked past, the way she caught people looking at Cole and then at her, and then back at Cole with expressions that ranged from curiosity to amusement to something that wasn't quite either. At the general store, the man behind the counter, broad-faced, 50s, the owner she guessed, greeted Cole with easy familiarity and then looked at Rosalie with the particular blankness of someone making a rapid reassessment. "This is Rosalie Mercer," Cole said. "She's managing my household." "Heard about you," the man said. He wasn't unfriendly, just sizing her up in the open, uncomplicated way of a man who didn't see a reason to be subtle about it. "Hank Orville, my wife runs the dressmaking." "Mr. Orville," she said. "You need the full order today?" he asked Cole. "Most of it. We've made some changes to the list." Cole handed it over, and Rosalie watched Orville's eyebrows go up slightly as he read. "You're adding pickling salt in a second vinegar order," Orville said. "Rosalie's going to put up preserves," Cole said. Orville looked at her again. This time, there was something else in the look. Reevaluation. "How many jars you planning to run?" "Depends on what I can harvest before the first frost," she said, "but I'm estimating between 30 and 40 to start, if the tomatoes and beans hold." He nodded slowly. "I can order you the extra salt in 2 weeks." "That'll work." They were at the counter for another 10 minutes while Cole sorted out the order. During that time, 2 women came into the store, stopped when they saw Rosalie, said something to each other under their breath, and then went about their business while stealing glances she was not meant to notice and could not miss. She noticed. She said nothing. She helped Cole compare 2 grades of rope to determine which one was the better value per foot. On the street afterward, while Cole loaded the wagon, a woman approached them directly. She was Rosalie's age or close to it, small, dark-haired, with a forthright way of walking that suggested she made her own decisions about whom she spoke to. "I'm Clara Dempsey," she said. "My husband has the farrier shop on the next block." She looked at Rosalie without the circumlocution the other women had used. "I wanted to introduce myself properly. I think how Croft treated you was shameful, and I've said so to anyone who brings it up." Rosalie looked at her. "Thank you." "I'm not telling you that for thanks. I'm telling you because you should know there are people in this town who have more sense than to think a woman's worth starts and stops at what she looks like." She paused. "If you're staying in the county, I'd like to know you better." Rosalie felt something shift slightly in her chest. Not dramatically, just a small movement of something that had been braced. "I'd like that," she said. Clara Dempsey nodded once like a thing settled and went back the way she'd come. Cole appeared at her elbow. He'd heard it. He didn't comment, just handed her up onto the wagon seat, and they headed back out of town with the loaded wagon and the particular quietness of 2 people who've been through something together and don't need to talk about it. After a while, Rosalie said, "Clara Dempsey, is she well regarded in town?" "Very," Cole said. "Her husband is one of the most respected men in the county. People listen to what she says." "Good." Rosalie looked out at the prairie. "Then having her say it matters." "You're thinking about your reputation. Aren't you thinking about yours?" she said. "You took in a woman no one in the county knew. People will have opinions about that regardless of what's actually happening." "Let them," he said. "Cole," she looked at him. "I'm serious. I don't want to cost you something you've worked for. If people decide to deal differently with you because of me, that has real consequences for the ranch." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily. The wagon creaked. "You know what I figured out?" he said. "What?" "The people who are going to think less of me for doing a decent thing were never going to amount to much as neighbors anyway. The people I want to deal with, people like Ernesto, like Clara Dempsey, like the Holloways, even though Margaret's complicated, those people are watching what you're doing with that garden and those ledgers and that kitchen, and they're deciding accordingly." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're an optimist," she said. "Not normally," he said. "I'm making an exception." The fence disaster happened in August. She heard the shouting from the garden, Cole's voice, lower than she usually heard it, carrying across the yard in a way that made her straighten and look toward the barn. A man she didn't recognize was on horseback at the edge of the yard, and Cole was on the ground in front of him, and the quality of the exchange was the kind that preceded either a resolution or something worse. She dropped her trowel and walked over. The man on horseback was heavy-set, red-faced from the sun, and possibly from his own temper, wearing a shirt with a torn collar and the expression of someone who'd been nursing a grievance for long enough that it had fermented into something considerably stronger. "My bull Maddox, and you know it. That fence has been down for 3 days and I've got proof. I've got men working it right now," Cole said. His voice was controlled in the way of someone being deliberately controlled. "The section came down in the storm last week. We identified it this morning. This morning. 3 days the bull's been in your pasture and you identified it this morning." The man's voice was heading somewhere ugly. "How many of my herd are in your south pasture? How many have I lost while your men were too busy to—" "One bull," Cole said flatly. "Your one bull, which is currently in my south pasture eating my grass. Nobody's lost anything." "That you know of." "That I know of," Cole agreed. "Because I looked." Rosalie stepped up beside Cole. Both men looked at her. "You're Mr. Decker," she said. The man on horseback stared at her. "Who are you?" "Rosalie Mercer. I manage Mr. Maddox's household." She kept her voice level. "I heard you mention proof. What form does that take?" Decker blinked. The sudden shift to practicality seemed to throw him. "What?" "You said you have proof the fence has been down 3 days. I'm asking what form the proof takes, because if there's a dispute about the timeline, the nature of the evidence matters." Decker looked at Cole. Cole's expression was unreadable. "I have a witness," Decker said. "One of my men saw the gap Sunday." "And your man came back to you with that information on Sunday?" "On Monday." "Then your complaint is 48 hours old," she said, "not 72. And in that 48 hours, Cole's crew has identified the break and begun repairs." She looked at the man steadily. "Your bull is intact, your herd appears intact by Cole's assessment, and the fence will be repaired today. Is there a material loss we've failed to account for?" Decker stared at her. He had the look of a man who had arrived prepared for one kind of confrontation and had been handed a completely different one. "No," he said, after a pause that was longer than it needed to be. "Then I'd suggest we note the date of repair in writing and agree that if any loss is identified in the next week's accounting, it'll be discussed then." She looked at Cole, who had gone very still. "Does that work for you?" "Works for me," Cole said carefully. Decker looked between them. His red face was doing something complicated. "Fine," he said eventually. He gathered his reins. He looked at Rosalie once more. Not with warmth, but with the specific regard a man gives to something that has surprised him. He turned his horse and rode out. The silence in the yard lasted about 4 seconds. 72 hours versus 48 hours, Cole said. "He counted from Sunday," she said. "His man didn't tell him until Monday. The distinction matters when you're trying to establish negligence." "How do you know to think about it that way?" "My aunt had a dispute with a neighbor over a property line. It dragged on for 2 years because no one thought clearly about what could actually be proven and what was just a feeling." She dusted off her hands. "I paid attention." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Not the measuring look she sometimes got from him. Something different. Something that had more in it. "Thank you," he said. She walked back to the garden. She heard him behind her, not following, just standing there in the yard for a moment before he turned and went back to the barn. And she made herself focus on the row in front of her, on the bean plants and the dry soil, and not on the warmth that had settled in her face that had nothing to do with the August sun. What she hadn't been prepared for was how other women would respond. Not all of them, Clara Dempsey had been genuine, and Margaret Holloway's version of acceptance, while complicated, was real enough. But there were others. She encountered two of them at the well 3 miles down the road, at the communal water point that served 4 ranches, on a morning in late August when the creek that fed Cole's property was running low, and she'd driven the water wagon out herself because both Cole and Ernesto were at the south pasture. The women were there when she arrived, 2 of them, wives of neighboring operations, both younger than her by several years, both wearing the particular expression that she recognized as a kind of social confidence that hadn't yet been tested in any real way. She pulled the wagon up and climbed down and went about the business of filling the barrels. She wasn't trying to engage, and they let her work in peace for about 2 minutes before one of them, the blonde with the blue dress, said something to the other in a low voice that was not nearly as low as intended. "Must need a strong back to haul that much." The other one covered a laugh. Rosalie continued working the pump handle. She was aware of the heat on her back, the weight of what she was doing, the ache already in her arms from the handle. She was also aware that if she turned around and acknowledged it, she would give them something they wanted, and she'd had a long career of denying people the thing they wanted. She filled the first barrel, started on the second. "I heard she runs his whole operation," the blonde one said, not lowering her voice by any significant degree this time. "Maddox can't find a real wife, so he's using her like one. Did you see the size of Sarah?" The second one, to her credit, sounded genuinely uncomfortable. "What?" "It's what everyone's saying. Everyone isn't saying it out loud at the well." Rosalie set the pump handle down. She turned around. She did it slowly, deliberately, and she looked at the blonde woman, Sarah, with the kind of patience that was not actually patience, that was the distilled residue of 27 years of this, turned into something harder and quieter and more durable than anger. "You can say what you want about my size," she said. "Most people who want to say it just don't say it loud enough to hear. I appreciate the honesty, if nothing else." She held the woman's gaze. "But understand something. I am at that ranch because a man did a decent thing when no one else would. I work for my keep. I earn my place every day. And when you go back and tell your neighbors what I'm like, you should also tell them that, because I suspect they're going to be seeing a lot more of me, and I'd prefer the version of me they hear about first be the accurate one." Sarah looked like she'd bitten into something sour. The second woman, whose name Rosalie still didn't know, looked at her with an expression that had shifted considerably from where it had started, toward something that, while not comfortable, had a quality of fairness in it. Rosalie turned back to the pump and finished filling the second barrel. She drove back to the ranch without looking behind her. Her hands on the reins were steady. Her jaw was tight. She made herself breathe out slowly, 3 times, the way she'd learned to. Not to calm down exactly, but to stop the tightening from traveling up into her shoulders where it would live for days. It was going to keep happening. She knew that. She'd known it before she'd arrived in Wyoming, and she knew it more concretely now, after 5 weeks of evidence. It was not going to stop because she handled it well or handled it badly. It was going to stop, if it ever stopped, because enough time passed, and enough of her work became visible, and enough people who'd laughed felt the specific embarrassment of having been wrong. That was a long time from now. For today, she had 2 full water barrels and a garden that needed them. She drove the wagon to the garden and started the work of distributing the water, and she didn't think about the well or the blue dress or any of it for the rest of the afternoon. Cole found out. She didn't tell him, but Ernesto had apparently been at the west fence line within earshot of the return road that morning, and had pieced together enough from the expression on her face when she came back to go and speak to Pete, who asked around on his next trip to town. And by the time Cole asked her about it that evening, he'd already heard most of the story from 3 different directions. "You should have told me," he said. They were at the table after supper, the ledger between them, though they'd stopped looking at it. "To what end?" she said. "I could talk to their husbands. And then their husbands come home and say something about it, and the wives know I told you, and it becomes 10 times worse." She folded the corner of a page that didn't need folding. "Leave it alone, Cole." "I don't like leaving it alone." "I know you don't." She looked at him. "But this is my thing to manage. You can't protect me from the way people see me. No one can do that. The only thing that changes it is time and evidence." She paused. "You gave me the time. I'm providing the evidence. That's the best system we have." He was quiet for a moment, his hands flat on the table, looking at the ledger without seeing it. When you were at the well, he said. What did you feel? The question surprised her. Men in her experience asked what happened, not what she'd felt about it. Tired, she said honestly. Not sad. Not angry exactly. Just tired of it being a thing. Tired of it being something I have to manage constantly, like another chore on the list. That's not fair. No, she agreed. It isn't. Does it make you want to leave? She looked at him. Something in how he'd asked it, carefully, like the question had weight, made her answer it carefully. No, she said. It doesn't make me want to leave. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he looked back down at the ledger. Good, he said, very quietly. It was a small word, just one word. She picked up the ledger and went back to the numbers. And across the table, Cole looked at the figures she'd written in her precise, steady handwriting, and the lamp between them burned down slowly, and neither of them said anything else for a while. Outside the window, the late August dark pressed against the glass, and the prairie went on in every direction, vast and demanding, and not particularly interested in what two people were carefully not saying to each other at a small table in a working ranch that was, by every measure that could be counted, beginning to find its footing. The tomatoes came in at the end of August. 31 plants, more than she'd expected to survive, producing more than she'd calculated. She spent 4 days at the stove putting up jars with Clara Dempsey, who came out to help on a Tuesday and stayed through Thursday, the two of them working in the particular comfortable rhythm of women who have found a practical common ground. They put up 43 jars of tomatoes, 20 of green beans, 16 of a pickle she'd developed from the recipe she'd remembered from her mother, adjusting the brine until she got the proportion right. Cole came into the kitchen on the last afternoon and stopped at the sight of it. The jars lined up in rows across every available surface, cooling and sealing, the smell of vinegar and dill, and something sweeter underneath it. Clara at the stove and Rosalie at the work table with her sleeves pushed up and her hair doing what it always did by the end of a long day. How many jars is that? He said. 79, Clara said, before Rosalie could answer. And another 12 of apple preserves from those dried apples Rosalie found hiding on your shelf. Cole looked at Rosalie. She didn't look at him. That's enough to supply 3 ranches through winter, he said slowly. I know, she said. Rosalie. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard quite that way before. Don't, she said. Just. She looked up at him then, and she meant to say something deflecting, something practical, something that kept the conversation on the level where she knew how to manage it. But he was looking at her in the way that had no performance in it, the way that was just looking, like she was a thing worth looking at, and she felt it land differently than usual. Thank you, he said. Just that. Clara Dempsey was studying a jar of pickles with great concentration and absolutely no interest in interrupting. You gave me the kitchen, Rosalie said, and the garden, and the time. She looked back down at the table. I just used them. The jars cooled on the surfaces around them, sealing themselves one by one with the small percussive sound of a lid pulling down. Outside, September was coming in on a shifting wind, and the ranch that had been struggling all summer had, without any single moment of drama, begun to look like something that was going to make it through winter. Cole went back outside. Clara waited exactly 30 seconds. He looks at you, she said. He looks at everything, Rosalie said. He's a careful man. Rosalie, Clara set down the jar. He looks at you differently than he looks at everything else. Rosalie lined up the next row of jars with geometric precision. Go home to your husband, Clara, she said. Clara went home to her husband. But she was smiling when she went, and Rosalie was aware of that, and she did not entirely know what to do with the particular warmth that had settled somewhere in her chest and showed no signs of leaving, and she did not, for the moment, try to make it go anywhere. The jars sold before October arrived. That wasn't the plan. The plan had been to supply the ranch through winter with enough surplus to see what demand looked like in the spring. But Clara Dempsey had mentioned the preserves to her husband, who had mentioned them to the farrier 2 doors down, who had mentioned them to a ranch wife who came in for a reshoeing on a Thursday, and by the time Rosalie understood what was happening, she had 4 separate inquiries and no mechanism for responding to them. Cole brought it to her on a Friday evening, setting a folded piece of paper on the table beside her coffee cup. She opened it. 4 names, 4 addresses, 4 notes about what they were looking for and what they were willing to pay. She looked at him. You took orders? I told them I'd pass it along, he said carefully. I didn't commit to anything. You should have talked to me first. I know. I'm talking to you now. She looked at the paper again. The prices they'd noted were fair. Better than fair, actually, for this county, which told her something about how Clara had described the product. She thought about the remaining jars, thought about the winter supplies she'd calculated, thought about the gap between what Cole's ranch currently earned and what it needed to earn. I'd have to put up more, she said. I don't have enough inventory to fill these and keep what we need. The Holloways have a surplus apple crop they haven't sold. I talked to Robert Holloway last week about it. He paused. I might have been thinking ahead. She stared at him. You were planning this. I was considering the possibility, he said, which she was learning was Cole's way of saying yes to things he hadn't fully committed to yet. She put the paper down and looked at the lamp between them, calculating. She had the jars. She had the technique. She needed more produce, more salt, more time, and some kind of reliable understanding with the buyers about volume and frequency, because one-off sales were worth less than a standing arrangement. If I do this, she said slowly, it has to be organized properly. Contracts, agreed quantities, delivery schedule. I won't take orders I can't fill, and I won't fill orders that shortchange what we need for winter. Agreed. And I'll need a full day in town next week to talk to the buyers directly, not through intermediaries. I'll take you. She looked at him. He was watching her with that particular steadiness he had, the one that wasn't pressure, just attention. You thought of this before I did, she said. You thought of it the moment you saw those jars lined up, he said. I just saw it a few days earlier. She was quiet for a moment. That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. She picked up the paper and looked at the names again. Outside, the first real cold of September was settling into the night air, and through the window the dark was the particular deep kind that came when the moon was down. She thought about Ohio, about the market her mother had built from a single summer's garden surplus. How small it had started, how much it had required of her, how she'd done it without a plan and without help, and made it work through sheer refusal to accept that it wouldn't. She thought about the fact that she was sitting at a table in Wyoming with a man who had quietly, methodically set up the conditions for her to succeed at something, and then handed her the steering without making a speech about it. All right, she said. Cole nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. That was all. They sat there a while longer, working through different numbers, and the night settled in around the ranch, and neither of them said anything that wasn't practical, and the practical things were enough, for now, to contain what was underneath them. The town meeting happened at the end of September, and Rosalie had not been invited. She found out about it the way she found out about most things in Mill Haven, through Clara, who came by on a Wednesday with flour and a look on her face that balanced between apology and anger in a way that Rosalie had learned to read as a signal. There was a gathering at the Orville place last Sunday, Clara said, not wasting time on approach. About a dozen women. Margaret Holloway wasn't there, for what that's worth. Rosalie waited. There's a feeling among some of them that the situation, you being at the ranch, not formally employed, not formally... Clara stopped, tried again. Some of them think it reflects badly on the county, that a woman living in an unmarried man's household without a clear arrangement is scandalous, Rosalie said. Their word was improper. Rosalie set down the jar she'd been filling. She looked at the window. The morning was clear and cold, the first proper cold of autumn, and the light was coming in sideways and making everything look flatter than it was. What do they want? She asked. Different things. Some of them want you to leave. Some of them want you to have a formal employment arrangement in writing. Some of them... Clara hesitated. What? Some of them think Cole should make his intentions clear, one way or the other. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Who organized it? Rosalie asked. Sarah Bellhurst, the one at the well. Clara said the name flatly, without inflection, which in Clara's speech was the equivalent of strong language. Rosalie thought about Sarah Bellhurst's face at the well in August. The voice that wasn't meant to carry. The look when Rosalie had turned around. Does Cole know? She asked. I don't know. It's possible someone told him. Clara was watching her carefully. How are you feeling about this? Rosalie looked at her hands. They were stained with harvest work. The knuckles roughened from the pump handle in the autumn cold, not the hand she'd arrived in Wyoming with 2 months ago. I'm not surprised, she said. I should have thought about how it looked more carefully from the start. You were trying to survive, Clara said. Yes, but surviving doesn't exempt you from other people's narratives about what you're doing. She looked up. I need to think. Clara left the flour and left her to it. She thought about it while she finished the jars, while she made the noon meal, while she distributed the afternoon water in silence. She thought about the word improper and what it actually covered and what it was a stand-in for. She thought about the genuine logistical problem. She had no formal arrangement with Cole. She had given no thought to how it appeared to the surrounding community because she'd been too busy proving she could do the work to consider the optics of doing it, and she was aware that optics, in a county like this, had real consequences. She thought about what to do, and she arrived at the only answer she could make herself live with. She needed to talk to Cole. She waited until after supper, when Pete and Ernesto had gone to the barn, and she sat down across from him at the table with her hands folded in front of her and told him what Clara had told her. She watched his interrupt. He didn't react in the large, demonstrative way some men did. No sudden anger, no declarations. He just listened with that particular quality of attention he gave to things that mattered. When she was done, there was a pause. Sarah Bellhurst, he said. Yes. Her husband owes me $60 from a cattle deal 2 years ago that he's been paying back at $5 a year. He said it without heat, just noted it. That's not relevant, Rosalie said. No, he agreed. It isn't. He looked at the table. What do you want to do? I think I need a formal employment arrangement, something in writing that makes clear what I do here and in what capacity. She kept her voice even. It won't satisfy everyone, but it removes the easiest criticism. Cole was quiet for a moment. Is that what you want? An employment arrangement? She looked at him. The question had something inside it that she was not going to examine at this particular table at this particular moment. I want to stay, she said carefully. I want to keep doing the work, and I want to do it in a way that doesn't cost you your standing in the county. What about your standing? Cole. She said his name with a patience she was mostly manufacturing. My standing in this county started on the ground and has been working upward. An employment arrangement helps it. It gives me a defined role and a legitimate reason to be here that has nothing to do with anyone's charity or anyone's speculation. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. All right, he said. I'll have it drawn up. Thank you. He started to get up. She stopped him. There's one more thing. He sat back down. The women at that meeting, she said, some of them have legitimate questions. I don't say that to excuse how they've behaved, but a woman living in an unmarried man's house without clear terms is genuinely unusual, and unusual things invite speculation. I should have thought about that earlier. She paused. I'm saying I understand why it looks the way it looks, even if the reality is different. Cole was quiet. The reality is that you saved this ranch from a supply disaster, settled a dispute with Decker that could have gone to court, built a food business in 3 months, and fixed my chicken coop, he said. That's the reality. I know that, you know that, Clara knows that. She looked at him. Sarah Bellhurst doesn't yet, and she won't until she has no other story to tell. He looked at her for a moment that stretched slightly past comfortable. Then he nodded, once, and got up and went to the door and stopped. Rosalie, he said, with his back to her. Yes. For what it's worth, the arrangement isn't why you're here. He said it to the door, not to her, which made it easier to hear. I'd have wanted you here on your own account if none of this had been complicated at all. He went out before she could answer, which was probably wise, because she didn't have an answer that was safe. October came hard and fast, and brought with it 3 things in rapid succession. The first, frost, which killed the last of the outdoor growing season and sent Rosalie into a fury of final harvesting that lasted 4 straight days. A letter from a ranch operation in the next county inquiring about purchasing preserves in bulk for the winter season, and Harlan Croft. Not all 3 on the same day. The frost came first, then the letter, and then Croft came on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of October, riding up the approach to the ranch alone, without his foreman, without the performance of men behind him. Just Croft on a good horse in a good coat, looking the way he always looked, like a man who occupied space by right. Rosalie was in the yard. She was checking the chicken coop repair. The board she'd nailed in August had held through the first weather events, but she wanted to look at the neighboring boards as well before winter. and she had a hammer in her hand when she heard the horse and turned and saw who it was. She didn't move. She stayed where she was. Croft saw her. He slowed his horse to a stop about 20 feet out, which was far enough to be deliberate. He looked at her. Not the dismissive inventory he'd performed in July. Something different, more measured. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Croft," she said. He looked at the yard, at the garden beds cleaned out and mulched for winter, at the organized woodpile that Pete and Ernesto had built under her direction, at the repaired fence line visible to the east. He looked at the house, where the chimney was producing the steady, well-drawing smoke of a properly maintained flue. He looked back at her. "You've done well for yourself," he said. She held the hammer loosely at her side. "I've done well for the ranch," she said. "And for yourself." He nodded slightly. "I've heard." "What have you heard?" He seemed to consider the question. "That you know how to run an operation. That Maddox's numbers are improving. That you've started a food business." A pause. "That you handled Decker." Decker was straightforward. Decker sued the last man he had a fence dispute with. He said it without emphasis. "Did you know that?" She hadn't. "No?" "Well, he didn't sue Maddox." He looked at her steadily. "Miss Mercer, I want to speak plainly." "That would be a change," she said. Something moved in his face. Not offense. He was beyond taking offense from her, she thought, in the way men sometimes moved past a grievance when they wanted something. "I was wrong," he said, "in July. I made a judgment I shouldn't have made on the basis I made it, and it was wrong." She looked at him. The hammer was very still at her side. "I'm telling you this because I'd like to discuss whether you would consider a formal arrangement with my property," he said, "as household manager. The compensation I can offer is substantially more than what you're receiving from Maddox. The estate is larger, the operation is more complex, and you would have—" "No," she said. He stopped. "I'm not interested," she said. Croft looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had not expected that word from this particular person, who had, somewhere in his calculations, failed to account for the possibility that the answer was already settled. "You haven't heard the terms," he said. "I don't need to." "Miss Mercer." "Mr. Croft." She kept her voice level, not hard, not cold, just very, very clear. "You looked at me in July and you made a decision. You communicated that decision in 3 sentences. You had a man hand me an envelope so you wouldn't have to look at me again." She paused. "I am not a circumstance that improves with better financial terms." He looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face that she thought might be a real thing. Not embarrassment exactly, something with more weight than that. "You're right," he said quietly. She hadn't expected that either. "I didn't handle it the way a man should handle it," he said. "I'm telling you that and meaning it. And I understand if that changes nothing." He gathered his reins. "The offer stands if you change your mind, but I won't press it." He turned his horse. "Mr. Croft," she said. He looked back. "Why do you think you can look past it now?" "My appearance." "Which hasn't changed." He held her gaze. "Because I've spent 3 months watching what you've built from nothing on a struggling ranch, and it turns out I'm capable of learning from evidence when the evidence is clear enough." He paused. "I should have been capable of it in July." He rode away. She stood in the yard with her hammer and watched him go until he was past the bend. Then she turned back to the chicken coop and checked the remaining boards, because they needed checking, and the work in front of her was the most reliable thing she had. Cole appeared from the barn 15 minutes later. He'd seen the rider. "That was Croft," he said. "Yes." "What did he want?" She told him factually, without emphasis. Cole listened. His jaw did the thing it sometimes did when he was being careful about his expression. "And you said no," he said. "I said no." A pause. "Did you think about it?" She looked at him. The question was honest. He wasn't asking because he wanted to catch her at something. He was asking because he was Cole and he dealt in accurate information. "Not really," she said. "No." He nodded. There was a quality to the nod she didn't analyze. "I need to look at the south fence line this afternoon," he said. "Do you want to come? I could use someone to hold the wire while I work the post." "Let me put the hammer away," she said. The fire started on a Thursday. Rosalie smelled it before anyone saw it, that specific quality of smoke that wasn't from a chimney, that came on the wind from the wrong direction and had the sharp character of something burning that shouldn't be. She was in the kitchen at mid-morning, and she stopped what she was doing and went to the door and looked south. The smoke was visible on the horizon, not a thin column. A front, broad and rolling, moving with the wind, which had been building since dawn in the way that warned of bad weather and had instead delivered something worse. She stood at the door for 3 seconds. Then she went back into the kitchen and started thinking. Cole was already gone. He'd left at first light with Ernesto to check on the far eastern pasture. Pete was at the barn. She went to the barn first. "Pete, fire to the south. Can you see it from up top of the barn?" Pete scrambled up the side of the barn with the agility of youth and looked south and came back down the color of chalk. That's a big fire. How far?" "Maybe 4 miles, maybe 3. Wind's pushing it." He was already looking at her for direction, which told her something useful about her own standing at this ranch. "What do we do?" She made herself think clearly. Cole was east. The fire was south and moving north with the wind. Depending on its spread, it could reach the Holloway property, the Dempsey property, 2 or 3 smaller operations before it reached the Maddox land. The cattle in the south pasture needed to be moved. There were families on the ranches between here and the fire line who needed warning. "Get the cattle out of the south pasture," she said. "Move them north of the creek. Can you do that alone?" Yes, I think yes. Do it now and don't stop for anything. I'll go for Cole." She didn't take the wagon. She took Cole's second horse, a brown mare she'd been watching him handle for weeks and had her own sense of by now. And she rode south and east, pushing harder than she usually did, angling toward where Cole had said he'd be, and watching the smoke to the south thicken and spread as the wind found more to feed it. She found him at the eastern fence line with Ernesto, already mounted. He'd seen the smoke. He turned the second he heard her coming. "How bad?" he called. 3 or 4 miles south, moving fast. I've got Pete moving the south pasture cattle." He exchanged a look with Ernesto that was some rapid calculation about priorities. "We need to warn the Dempseys and the Hendersons first. Their properties are closest to the fire line." "I can ride to the Dempseys," Rosalie said. "Rosalie, Cole, I can ride." "You know I can. Send me." Another look at Ernesto. Ernesto said nothing, but his expression was not opposed. "Go," Cole said. "If the fire gets within a mile of the Dempsey property, you turn north and you don't stop. You understand?" "Yes." She turned the mare and went. The ride to the Dempsey property was about 2 miles, and by the time she arrived, the smoke to the south had spread enough that she could smell it clearly on every breath of wind. Clara Dempsey came out of the house when she heard the horse, took one look at Rosalie's face, and then at the southern sky, and said "James," in a voice that brought her husband out of the barn at a run. "Fire," Rosalie said. "Moving north. You need to go." "The horses," Clara said immediately. "Take them. Take the wagon if you can hitch it fast. Don't take anything else unless it's on your way out the door." She looked at James Dempsey, who was already moving. "The Henderson place?" "Half-mile east," he said over his shoulder. "I'll go." She went. Henderson was already loading his family into a wagon when she arrived. He'd seen the smoke himself and hadn't waited. She told him about the Maddox Ranch as a gathering point, the northern position, the creek as a fire break, and he nodded and drove without ceremony. She turned back. The smoke was close enough now that the air had changed. Her eyes were beginning to water and the mare was unhappy about it, tossing her head and wanting to turn north. Rosalie held her steady and went back toward the Maddox property, cutting across open land rather than taking the road, and arrived to find the yard transformed. Ernesto had brought 3 of the horses and was tying them to the far fence. Pete had gotten the cattle north of the creek. She could hear them in the distance, restless and loud. 2 wagons she didn't recognize were already in the yard. The Dempseys. And behind them an older couple she'd seen in town but didn't know by name. Clara was already at the pump, filling every available bucket and barrel, working with the focused efficiency of a woman who'd made rapid decisions about what mattered. A child was crying somewhere. Rosalie followed the sound to the side of the Dempsey wagon and found a girl, 6 or 7 years old, sitting against the wheel with her knees pulled up, crying the silent kind of crying that was worse than the loud kind. Rosalie crouched down beside her. It wasn't easy. It cost her something physically, that movement, but she did it. "What's your name?" she asked. The girl looked at her. Alice, Alice, I need your help. She kept her voice level, matter of fact, the way she'd have talked to herself in a hard moment. Do you see those horses over by the fence? They're frightened by the smoke. Horses are better when someone is with them. Can you go stand near them and talk to them? Alice looked at the horses, looked at Rosalie. What do I say? Whatever you'd say to something that was scared. Just talk. They'll hear your voice. She met the girl's eyes. You're going to be fine, and so are they. But they need someone. Alice got up and went to the horses. Rosalie watched her for a moment, then stood. 2 more families arrived over the next hour. Cole came back with Ernesto at midday, covered in ash and grim-faced, having spent the morning helping coordinate the burning of a firebreak strip 2 miles south, a desperate and imperfect measure that might slow the fire's advance enough to matter. He came straight to Rosalie. How many here? He said. 4 families, 11 people including children. The Anderson place is still unaccounted for. I don't know if they got out. They got out. I saw them on the road south. He looked around the yard, at the organized chaos she'd been managing, the water supply, the fire she'd built in the yard for cooking, because she'd understood hours ago that this was going to be a long day and people needed to eat. You've been feeding them. There are children, she said, and the adults need to function. He looked at her for a moment, the ash on her face, the set of her jaw, the way she was already looking past him to the next thing that needed doing. Rosalie, he said, is the firebreak going to hold? He let the subject change happen. Maybe. Depends on the wind. If it shifts south, yes. If it stays north, he shook his head. Then we keep these people here and we make sure they're ready to move further north if we need to. She said it without drama. What do you need from me right now? Nothing, he said quietly. You've already done it. She looked past him at the yard, at Clara managing water distribution, at James Dempsey and the older man she didn't know. Making a firebreak around the near side of the house, at Pete running messages between them, at Alice Dempsey standing beside the horses talking to them in the serious, intent voice of a child who'd been given a job and intended to do it. No, I haven't, she said. Not yet. The wind shifted at 3 in the afternoon. Not dramatically, just a 3-degree turn, just enough to angle the fire's edge away from the creek line. Cole and Ernesto had ridden back to the firebreak, and when the shift came, the 2 men on that line read it in the smoke's movement and pushed hard at the brake for another 2 hours until the fire's forward momentum faltered and then stalled. By evening, it wasn't out. But it wasn't advancing. People stayed the night rather than risk the roads in the dark with ash still in the air. Rosalie made a meal from what she had, stretched it, the way she'd learned to stretch things, and it fed 11 people without anyone going hungry, which she registered as a small private victory in the middle of a larger and more frightening day. She put the children down on every soft surface in the house, arranged the adults in the barn and in the wagon beds, and moved through it all with the systematic calm she'd been maintaining since morning. She sat down for the first time at close to midnight, on the porch step, and felt the full weight of the day descend on her at once. Cole sat down beside her. She hadn't heard him come out. They didn't say anything for a while. The night was still carrying smoke, fainter now, but present, and the stars were hazed. Alice, he said eventually, what about her? She was talking to those horses for 4 hours. He paused. Never left them. She needed something to do, Rosalie said. People function better when they have something to do. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Is that why you kept moving today? So you'd function better? She thought about it. I kept moving because there were people who needed things. She looked at the dark yard, the shapes of wagons, the quiet. I didn't have time to be scared. Were you scared? Yes, of course. She looked at her hands, folded in her lap. I was scared the whole time. I just didn't let it be the loudest thing. He was quiet beside her, and the night was quiet around them, and somewhere to the south the fire was doing something she couldn't see, and it might be dying, or it might be waiting for wind, and there was nothing to do about it in this moment except sit on a porch step and be tired. People saw you today, Cole said. She looked at him. The family's here, the way you organized it, what you did for Alice. He paused. These are the same county as Sarah Bellhurst. They'll go home and they'll tell people. She understood what he was saying. She also understood that she hadn't done any of it for that reason, and she was aware, in the particular way of a woman who had spent 27 years watching what she did get attributed to what she was, that there was something important about that distinction. "I know," she said. "Does it matter to you that they saw?" She thought about it honestly. "It matters less than I thought it would," she said, "and more than I'd like it to." He nodded slowly, not disagreeing, absorbing. "Cole." She said his name and then stopped. "What?" She looked at him directly, in the dark, with ash still in the air and 11 people sleeping in his barn and a fire somewhere to the south that might or might not be finished with them. She looked at him and she thought about what to say, and she found she didn't have words for all of it. For the day, for the 3 months before the day, for the particular quality of a man who made room for her to be capable and then stood back and let her be it. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for letting me handle it." He looked at her. His face in the dark was difficult to read, and he took a moment before he answered. "Rosalie," he said, "you didn't need my permission." She held that thought. It landed somewhere it needed to land. They sat on the porch step in the dark for another little while, and then the cold came in properly, and they went inside, separately, to sleep in the few hours left of the night. And outside, the Wyoming dark pressed down on a yard full of people who had made it through the worst of the day, because someone had thought clearly enough to organize the surviving of it. The families left the next morning. Not all at once. The Hendersons went first, at dawn, because Henderson had livestock to account for and couldn't wait. The Dempseys stayed until mid-morning, Clara helping Rosalie clean up from the night's feeding before she would let James hitch the wagon. The older couple. She'd learned their name was Garrett, wheat farmers from the north end of the county who'd come south to help relatives and gotten caught by the fire's spread. Left last, the husband shaking Cole's hand at length and saying something Rosalie couldn't hear from the porch where she was folding blankets. Alice Dempsey found her before the Dempsey wagon left. The girl came around the side of the house with the purposeful walk of someone who'd decided to do something and was doing it before she could change her mind. "The horses are fine," she said. Rosalie looked at her. "I know. You took good care of them." Alice considered this. "I talked to them about my cat," she said. "I don't know if they cared about the cat, but they stopped pulling at the rope." "Horses are good listeners," Rosalie said. "They don't need to understand the words. They just need the voice." Alice looked at her for a moment with the frank, evaluating gaze of a child deciding whether an adult was worth trusting. Then she said, "My mother says you're the reason we're all right." Rosalie folded the last blanket and set it on the pile. "Your mother did most of the water work herself. I just pointed at the pump." "That's not what she says." "Alice," Clara Dempsey's voice from the wagon. "Come on." Alice went. Rosalie watched the wagon pull out of the yard, and she stood on the porch with the stack of folded blankets and felt the particular hollow that follows a crisis. Not relief exactly, but the specific absence of the tension that had been holding everything together, and the sudden awareness of how tired she was under it. Cole came around the side of the house. He was still covered in ash from the day before, which meant he'd slept in it, which meant he'd prioritized the families over his own comfort, in a way she would have predicted but still noted. "Fire's out," he said. "Ernesto rode south at first light. The brake held." "How much burned?" "About 400 acres. 3 ranches took losses. Henderson lost a hay barn. The Kessler property on the south end got the worst of it. House is gone." She closed her eyes for a moment, opened them. "The Kesslers?" "They got out, families with her sister in Millhaven." He leaned against the porch rail. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely tired. Not the working tiredness of a man who'd spent a hard day, but the deeper kind that came from the margins being used up. "It could have been worse. A lot worse." "I know." He looked at her. "You should sleep." "So should you." "I've got the South Pasture cattle to bring back." "Pete can bring them. Tell Pete to bring them." She held his gaze. "You've been going since before dawn yesterday. Pete is 22 years old and recovered from yesterday by the time he went to sleep last night. Let him do it." Cole opened his mouth, and she could see the reflex forming, the one that said the work was his to do, that delegating felt like failing, and she watched him recognize it in himself and stop. "All right," he said. She went inside and slept for 4 hours. When she came back out, the yard was quiet. Cole was at the table with the ledger, which she hadn't expected. He'd washed, changed, looked more like himself. He had a cup of coffee at his elbow and was doing the kind of slow, careful accounting that meant he was calculating damage. She sat across from him and waited. After a while, he said, "The south pasture is fine. Pete got them back without incident." He turned a page. "The fire break cost us 2 days of other work. I'll need to assess what that means for the winter preparation timeline. The wood is cut and stacked. The root cellar is full." She thought through it. "The main exposure is the south fence line. If the ground freezes before we get to it, the repair becomes harder. But that's a week of work, not more." He made a note. Looked at the next column. His jaw tightened slightly. "What?" she said. "The Kesslers," he said. "Their house is gone. They're at her sister's, but that's not a permanent situation. They've got 3 kids. She looked at him. "What are you thinking?" "There's lumber in the south barn I've been sitting on for 2 years. Bought it for an expansion I couldn't afford to finish." He tapped the pencil against the ledger. "It's not enough to build a house, but combined with what other ranches might contribute, it could be." She understood. "You want to organize a build?" "It's what you do out here," he said, "or what you're supposed to do." "Who coordinates it?" He looked at her steadily. "I was going to ask if you would." She looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon was bright and cold and entirely indifferent to the question being asked at this table. She thought about this Kessler family, whom she'd never met, at the sister's house in Mill Haven. She thought about 3 children. She thought about what it felt like to arrive somewhere with nowhere to go. "Tell me what you know about the Kessler property," she said. "Layout, dimensions, what they had before." He told her. She took notes. They spent an hour on it, and by the end she had the outline of a coordination plan that she would take to Clara and James Dempsey, who knew the county better than she did yet, and would know which ranches had materials and which had labor to contribute and in what proportions. At the end of the hour, Cole leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she'd been noticing more in the last weeks. Not the measuring look of the early days, something that had settled deeper than that. "You know," he said, "when I offered you a place to stay in July, I thought I was solving a problem for the afternoon." "I know," she said. "I didn't think—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't understand what I was actually doing." She looked at him carefully. "What were you actually doing?" He was quiet for a moment that had a weight in it. "I was making the best decision I've made in years," he said, without knowing it. She held his gaze. The kitchen was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that comes after a lot of noise has finally stopped. "Cole," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not—" He picked up the pencil, put it down. "I'm not saying it yet. I just want you to know I'm thinking it." She didn't answer. She looked at the ledger and turned it back toward herself and went back to the Kessler numbers, because that was the thing in front of her that she could manage. But she was aware of the warmth in her face that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth, and she did not try to argue it away. The Kessler build happened over 4 days in late October, on a Saturday through Tuesday, that the county assembled for with the particular organized chaos of people who know how to show up for hard work, but don't necessarily know how to do it together without someone pointing. Rosalie pointed. She'd spent the intervening 2 weeks doing what she'd told Cole she'd do, working through Clara and James Dempsey, through the Holloways, through Hank Orville at the general store, who turned out to be a reliable information hub when properly engaged. She'd made a list of every contributing ranch, what each was bringing in materials and labor, what the build required in sequence, and who needed to be where on which day. Margaret Holloway had looked at the plan when Rosalie presented it at her kitchen table and said, without her usual armor of social calculation, "You did this in 2 weeks while also running Maddox's household." "I had help," Rosalie said. "Not as much as you're crediting." Margaret looked at the plan for another moment. "Robert will bring the team in the heavy wagon, and I'll come to manage the feeding. I've already got Clara." "Clara is excellent," Margaret said. "I'm better at volume. We'll work together." She said it in the tone of someone closing a negotiation they've already won, and Rosalie, who recognized the tone, accepted it. The build was loud and imperfect, and several things went differently than planned. The lumber from Cole's south barn was slightly warped from 2 years of sitting and required more work to true than anticipated, which slowed the framing on the first day. A dispute broke out on the second day between 2 ranchers about the correct angle for the roof pitch that consumed an hour, and was ultimately settled by Ernesto, who said 12 words in a flat, precise voice and produced a level, ending the argument with the completeness of a door closing. Rosalie moved through all of it, between the food table and the build site, managing supplies, translating between Margaret's organizational preferences and Clara's more intuitive approach, making judgment calls when people came to her with problems instead of going to each other. She didn't notice, in the middle of it, when people stopped treating her as the person who organized the food and started treating her as the person who organized everything. She noticed it afterward when she thought back. At the time, she was just doing the next thing. Martin Kessler found her at the end of the second day, when the walls were up and the roof framing was started and his wife had cried twice and stopped herself both times, and was now standing at the food table handing out coffee with a steadiness that Rosalie recognized as the specific strength of people who have used all their braking on the inside. Martin Kessler was a quiet man, 50s, weathered in the deep way of people who've been outdoors their whole lives. He stood next to Rosalie and looked at the frame of his house and didn't say anything for a moment. "You didn't know us," he said finally. "No," she said. "You still—" He stopped, tried again. "My wife told me about the fire day, what you did at Maddox's ranch." He looked at her. "And then this." "The county does this," she said. "I just made a list." "Miss Mercer." His voice was careful. "I know what it means when someone makes a list and gets 4 ranches to show up with lumber. I've been in this county 20 years. I know how hard that is to pull together." He looked back at the frame. "I don't know how to thank you." "Build it to last," she said. "That's all the thanks I need." He looked at her once more, then went back to his wife. Rosalie watched them for a moment. The way he put his hand briefly on her back. The way she didn't look at him but leaned slightly toward the touch. And then she went back to the food table because there were 30 people who'd been working since dawn, and it was almost evening. Cole appeared at her elbow. She'd been watching him work throughout the 2 days. On the build itself, doing the physical labor without any performance of authority, taking direction from the men who knew more about framing than he did, without ego, contributing where he had more to offer. He had a long scrape on his right forearm from a lumber edge that he hadn't mentioned and she'd noticed and not commented on because he would have deflected. "The roof will be done tomorrow," he said, "if the weather holds." She handed him coffee without him asking. "How's your arm?" He glanced at it. "Fine." "Let me look at it tonight. Lumber cuts go bad fast in this weather." He accepted this without argument, which told her it was bothering him more than he'd admitted. "Margaret's in her element," he said, looking toward where Margaret Holloway was directing the food operation with the precision of a general. "She's good at it," Rosalie said. "She just needed someone to point the direction." "And you pointed it." "I made a list," she said. "I keep saying that. And I keep not believing it's that simple." He looked at her sideways. There was something in his expression she'd been seeing more of lately. Not the controlled, careful look. Something that had less armor in it. "After this is done. When it's just us again." She looked at him. "What about it?" "I want to talk to you," he said. "About something that isn't the ranch." She held his gaze for a moment. She knew what the something was. She'd known what it was since the night on the porch, maybe before. Maybe since the table with the ledger when he'd said, "I'm not saying it yet." "All right," she said. He nodded and went back to the build. She went back to the food table. Margaret, who had been within earshot, said nothing, but the look she gave Rosalie over a pot of coffee had very little innocence in it, and Rosalie chose not to see it. They drove back from the Kessler property on the last day with the wagon empty of lumber and the sky the color of pewter, promising weather. Pete had stayed at the ranch and Ernesto had gone in a separate direction, which meant the drive back was just the two of them on the wagon bench with the cold coming in from the north and the horses moving at the steady pace of animals that know they're going home. She waited to see if he'd start it. He didn't, for the first mile. Then, "I've been trying to figure out how to say something for about 6 weeks, he said. "I know," she said. "You know what I'm going to say?" "I have a reasonable idea." He was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved. A gust came through and she pulled her coat tighter and he seemed to not notice the cold. "I don't have a speech," he said. "I'm not a man who makes speeches. I want to say that first so you know what you're getting." "I've noticed," she said. "What I can tell you is that somewhere between the ledger and the chicken coop and the Decker situation and the fire, I stopped. I stopped thinking of this as temporary." He looked at the road ahead, not at her. I stopped thinking of you as a circumstance, a problem I'd solved for an afternoon. He paused. I started thinking of you as mine, not mine like property, mine like the person I look for when something happens, the person whose opinion I want first, the person I... He stopped. She could see him working through it, and she made herself wait, because this was a man who used words carefully, and what he said when he found them would mean exactly what it said. I'm in love with you, he said. I don't know when it happened. It happened slowly, and then I looked up one day, and it was just there, solid, like it had been there for a while, and I'd been too busy to name it. She looked at him. He was still looking at the road, which was the posture of a man who had said the thing and was now facing the most honest kind of waiting. Cole, she said. He looked at her. She thought about how to say the truth of it. Not the polished version, not the protected version, the actual one. I spent my whole life, she said carefully, believing that what I looked like was the main thing anyone would ever see. I believed it because the evidence was consistent. She looked at her hands on her lap. I came to Wyoming on a practical arrangement because I thought practical was what I was eligible for. Because wanting something more felt like setting myself up to fail. He was listening, completely. And then you sat down across from me and asked what the fall numbers were, she said. And you let me fix your flu and reorganize your shelves and argue with you about the feed supplier. And you never once, not once, made me feel like my body was the most important thing in the room. She looked up at him. Do you know how long it had been since someone did that? No, he said quietly. A long time. She held his eyes. I don't have a speech either. What I have is, I chose to stay. Every morning for 5 months, I could have figured out another option, and I chose to stay. And the reason I chose to stay wasn't the food business or the garden or the ledger. It was you. She paused. You, specifically, the way you are. The way you let me be what I am without asking me to be less of it. He was very still. I love you, she said. I didn't plan to. I didn't come here looking for it. But I love you, and I've known it since roughly the morning you told Decker that you'd looked. Something moved in his face, something that had been held in careful check for a long time and was being released in the very specific way of a man who doesn't let go of things easily. He reached across the bench and took her hand. Not dramatically. Just put his hand over hers, on her lap, the way you'd put your hand on something you intended to keep. I should have said it sooner, he said. You said it when you meant it, she said. That matters more. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that had a completely different quality than it had started with. His hand over hers on the cold bench, the horses moving steadily, the pewter sky beginning to deliver on its promise in the form of small, dry flakes of the season's first snow. She'd been thinking in the days that followed about what she wanted. Not what was practical, not what made sense, not what she was eligible for, what she actually wanted. It was an exercise she'd had very little practice with. She wanted the ranch. She wanted the kitchen and the garden and the ledger. She wanted Clara Dempsey for a friend and Ernesto for his 7 words of precise advice delivered exactly when she needed them, and Pete for his relentless, artless affection that she'd stopped finding naive and started finding genuinely sustaining. She wanted Cole. Not as gratitude, not as relief, not as the best option available. She wanted him because she'd watched him for 5 months make honest decisions in hard situations, because he'd told her the truth about his own fear at that early morning table, because he'd handed her a kitchen and a ledger and a yard and stood back and let her determine what she made of them without ever implying he was waiting for her to fail. She wanted, and this was the thought that still surprised her when she let herself finish it, a life here. A real one, built on ground she'd helped prepare. She told him that on a Sunday morning in November, at the table, with the first serious snow of the season coming down outside and the fire drawing perfectly through the adjusted flue and the coffee between them, she said, I want to stay, permanently, not as your employee and not as a circumstance, as your partner, equally. He looked at her over his coffee cup. Is that a proposal? He said. It might be, she said. I've never made one. I'm not sure I'm doing it right. He set the cup down. He looked at her with the particular steadiness that she had, over 5 months, come to understand was his version of care. Not soft, not decorated, just completely present. You're doing it right, he said. Yes? Yes, he said, simply. Yes. She let out a breath she hadn't been aware of holding. He reached across the table and she reached back, and they sat there with the snow coming down outside and the fire going and the warmth of the kitchen around them, which was different from any warmth she'd been in before because she'd had a part in building every aspect of it. It's not going to be easy, she said, because she was who she was and she couldn't let the moment be entirely clean. People will still talk. Sarah Bellhurst isn't going to be gracious about it. I know, he said, and I'm not a different person than the one who arrived here. I still take up the space I take up. I'm not going to become something smaller to make other people comfortable. I know that too, he said. I wouldn't ask you to. I just want to be clear that you understand what you're agreeing to. Rosalie. He said her name with a quiet firmness that stopped her. I've been watching you for 5 months. I know exactly what I'm agreeing to. A pause. Do you know what you're agreeing to? She considered him. The scrape on his forearm had healed cleanly. He still ate the same breakfast 4 days out of 7. He still worked past the point of good sense and had to be told to let Pete do things. He was stubborn about his own discomfort, cautious about his own hope, slow to start things, and then unwilling to stop them. Yes, she said. I know exactly. Then we're agreed, he said. Outside, the snow came down on the first winter of a ranch that had been struggling when summer started and was going to make it through the cold in better shape than anyone in the county had predicted, including the 2 people sitting at the table inside it. Cole rode to Mill Haven the following week and spoke to the justice of the peace about what was required. He came back with the information and gave it to Rosalie without editorial, and they set a date for December, which gave them time to get through the most urgent winter work first, because they were both the kind of people who handled the urgent work before the important things, which was a flaw they shared and had discussed without resolving. She wrote a letter to Ohio, not to her aunt, who had never been warm about Rosalie's prospects, and would receive the news with the specific sourness of someone who'd been proven wrong. To a cousin in Cincinnati who had been, in the years when Rosalie was growing up, the closest thing to consistent kindness she'd had from family. The letter was not long. She'd always been better at saying things directly than building up to them. She told her cousin about Wyoming, about the ranch, about Cole. She told her about the garden and the preserves business and the Kessler build. She did not editorialize about the summer. She ended by saying she was going to be married in December, and she thought she might be happy, which was different from thinking she would be comfortable or provided for, and the difference mattered to her considerably. She sealed the letter and gave it to Pete to take to town on his next errand, and she went back to the kitchen, which needed attention, and she did not wait for the feeling in her chest to settle into something she recognized before she moved on to the next thing. That was in the last week of November. The wedding was 3 weeks away. There was a ranch to run in the meantime, and the winter pressing in with its usual indifference to personal arrangements, and Ernesto's observation that the north pasture fence needed reinforcement before the ground froze solid, and a second bulk order for preserves from the operation in the next county that needed filling. She sat at the table with the ledger and looked at the numbers and thought about what she'd said to Cole at the table in July. I'd need to know what your suppliers are and what you're currently paying, 5 months ago. Said to a man she'd known for less than a day. She thought about how sure she'd been that this was temporary, that she would figure out the next thing, that she would not make the mistake of building on someone else's kindness. She thought about what it meant that she'd been wrong about all of it in the best possible way. She picked up her pencil and went back to the numbers, and the fire burned steadily in the properly drawing hearth. And outside the Wyoming winter did what it always did, which was make everything more difficult and more beautiful at the same time. And inside the small ranch house that she had in 5 months, made into something neither of them had known they needed, Rosalie Mercer sat with the ledger and the warmth and the life she had built herself into, and for the first time in as long as she could clearly remember, she was not waiting for the other shoe to drop. The wedding was on a Saturday in the second week of December, which turned out to be the coldest Saturday the county had seen since 1877, according to Robert Holloway, who tracked such things with the dedication of a man who had decided weather history was worth preserving. Nobody stayed home because of the cold. That was the thing Rosalie hadn't expected. She'd planned for a small gathering, the Dempseys, the Holloways, Ernesto, Pete, the justice of the peace. Practical and contained, which was how she planned most things. What she got was something considerably larger, because in Sweetwater County, Wyoming, in December of 1881, word traveled faster than cold fronts, and the word had traveled thoroughly. The Kesslers came. Martin and his wife arrived in their wagon, the one they'd bought secondhand after the fire, the one that replaced what they'd lost, with their 3 children bundled in every piece of fabric the family owned. Their new house had been finished in November, the roof tight and the walls solid, and they came through the cold with the particular purposefulness of people repaying a debt they hadn't been asked to repay. Clara Dempsey arrived early enough to help Rosalie with the food, which Rosalie had been insisting she could handle alone, and Clara had been ignoring that insistence for 3 weeks. She came through the door at 7 in the morning with James behind her carrying a crate, and she looked at what Rosalie had already prepared and said, "Good," in the tone of someone genuinely relieved. And they worked side by side in the kitchen for 3 hours without needing to talk much, because they'd been working side by side long enough to have developed their own shorthand. Margaret Holloway arrived with Robert at 10 and immediately began reorganizing the seating arrangement in the main room, which Rosalie watched from the kitchen doorway for a moment and then deliberately did not intervene in, because Margaret reorganizing seating was Margaret showing care, and Rosalie had learned to read that correctly. Pete had polished his boots. She noticed this when he came in from the barn, the boots conspicuously cleaner than the rest of him, and she felt something warm and involuntary move through her chest at the sight of it. He'd also combed his hair in a way that suggested effort without fully achieving results, and he looked at her in the green dress, the same green cotton she'd arrived in, freshly pressed, the best she owned, with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that she had to look away. "You look real nice, Miss Rosalie," he said. She looked back at him. "You polished your boots," she said. He looked down at them, back up at her. "Seemed right," he said. Ernesto wore a jacket she'd never seen before, dark wool, clearly kept for occasions, fitting him well in the way of a garment that had been owned for a long time. He said nothing when he came in, only looked at her steadily for a moment with the evaluating patience he gave everything, and then nodded once in the way that meant he had decided something was as it should be. Cole was in the barn when she went out to tell him people were arriving. She found him there not working, just standing near the horse he'd had the longest, an older bay he called Nothing in particular, a name she'd never figured out, with one hand on its neck. He turned when he heard her. He was wearing his good shirt. His hair was damp, combed. He looked like himself, only more deliberately so, and it struck her that that was all anyone could ask of a person for a significant occasion, to be themselves, more carefully. "People are here," she said. "I know." He hadn't moved. "I was just thinking." "About what?" He looked at her for a moment. "July," he said. "The road." She walked the few feet between them and stood in front of him. Outside the barn, the cold was absolute, but in here the animals had kept the temperature above brutal, and the light coming through the gaps was pale and quiet. "I was so sure I was just solving a problem for the afternoon," he said. "You were," she said. "You were also doing something else at the same time. People can do 2 things at once." He looked at her face, the way he looked at things that mattered to him, with that complete, unpretentious attention. "Are you nervous?" he asked. "Yes," she said honestly. "Not about you, about all those people watching." "I know." A pause. "I am too." "You're nervous?" "I'm not made of wood," he said, which surprised a genuine laugh out of her, sudden and real, and she saw it land on his face the way good things landed on him, quietly, with warmth. "Come inside," she said. "Claire's been in my kitchen since 7 and she's going to start running it by 11 if we don't claim it back." He followed her in. The ceremony was short, which was what both of them had wanted. The justice of the peace, a dry, competent man named Aldrich, who'd performed marriages in this county for 12 years, and had the slightly abstracted air of a man who'd said these words often enough that he had to work to make them present. He made them present. Rosalie noticed him make the effort, noticed him look at the 2 of them directly when he said the words that mattered, and she appreciated it. Cole's hands were cold when he took hers. She could feel that. His grip was steady anyway. She said what she meant to say. She'd thought about it, not prepared a speech, just thought about what was true and how to say it in front of people without making it into a performance. What came out was close enough to what she'd thought and real enough to matter. He said less. He was Cole. What he said was precise and had no wasted language and meant every word. When it was done, Clara cried, which she'd announced she wasn't going to do, and then did anyway, with the resigned acceptance of a woman who knows her own nature. James put his arm around her. Pete made a sound that he immediately covered with a cough. Ernesto was still and quiet, and his face had the particular quality it had when he approved of something but considered the approval private. Margaret Holloway did not cry, but she looked at Rosalie across the room with an expression that had come a long way from the horseback evaluation in August, something that had moved over 4 months, from curiosity to respect to what Rosalie could only read as genuine, unguarded warmth. And she gave Rosalie a nod that was small and deliberate, and said more than most people's speeches. Martin Kessler shook Cole's hand and then, after a moment's visible consideration, turned to Rosalie and shook hers as well. His wife hugged her. It was unexpected and brief, and the woman smelled like wood smoke and cold air, and Rosalie hugged her back. The afternoon went long. The food was enough, more than enough, because Clara had done exactly what she'd come to do, and Rosalie was not going to argue with the results. People ate and talked, and the house was warm and full in a way it had never been in the months she'd been there, and she moved through it with the specific awareness of someone experiencing something they'd been told they weren't eligible for. She kept coming back to that thought. Not on that day. But she came back to it in the weeks that followed, when things settled back into the rhythm of the ranch, and the Wyoming winter did what it always did, which was make everything take longer and cost more, and require more of everyone. She thought about what she'd believed she was eligible for, and about how those beliefs had been built not from any single catastrophic moment, but from the accumulated weight of 1,000 small ones. A look here, a laugh there, a door that didn't open, an envelope passed without eye contact. She thought about the girl she'd been in Cincinnati who had answered a practical advertisement because she'd decided romance was for other people. She didn't have contempt for that girl. She understood her completely. She just knew things now that the girl in Cincinnati hadn't known, that practicality and love were not, in the end, opposites, that a man who helped you fix your chicken coop and argued with you about fall cattle timing and told you the truth about his own fear was performing a kind of love that the girl in Cincinnati hadn't had the evidence to recognize. She'd had to come to Wyoming to get the evidence. The snow came in earnest in January, the kind that settled in and didn't leave, that turned the ranch into an island of function in an expanse of white, that required a different kind of daily management, checking stock more frequently, burning more wood, keeping a closer eye on the food stores she'd built up against exactly this. She'd built them up well. That was the honest accounting of it. The root cellar was full, the preserved goods were sufficient, the winter supply calculations she'd made in September had been accurate enough that they were on track without the crisis mode rationing that Cole had told her the previous winter had required. He told her that on a January evening when they were at the table, still with the ledger between them, some things didn't change even after everything else did. And he said it matter-of-factly, the way he said things that he meant seriously. Last winter I was short on salt provisions by February and had to make an emergency run to Millhaven in weather that wasn't safe to drive in, he said. I know, she said. You told me about it back in September. That's why I doubled the salt order. He looked at her. You planned for that from September. I planned for everything I could identify as a risk from September, she said. That's what planning is. He was quiet for a moment, then, I want you to know something. She looked up from the ledger. His expression was the careful, deliberate one that meant he'd been thinking about something for a while. I was running this place wrong, he said. Not because I'm not a capable rancher, but because I was running it alone and trying to carry the whole operation in my head, and some things were falling through. And I knew it, and I didn't. I didn't know how to fix it, because the thing I needed was a different way of seeing it, and you can't give yourself a different way of seeing from inside the same set of habits. She held his gaze. You gave me that, he said. The ledger, the supplier renegotiation, the preserves business, all of it. You came in and you saw it differently because you weren't inside my habits yet, and that changed things. You let me, she said. You could have told me to stay in the kitchen and not touch your systems. I could have, he agreed. I almost did the day you showed me the ledger. There was a part of me that... He stopped, considered. Pride. The part that says a man should know his own operation, and if he doesn't, he's failing. That's not pride, she said. That's fear dressed up as pride. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. You're right. It is. She looked back at the ledger. The difference between this winter and last winter isn't me, she said. It's us. What I can plan depends on what you know about the cattle and the pastures and the land. What you can execute depends on what I can organize in the supply and the household. Neither of us does the other one's job better than they do it. We just cover the parts the other can't see from where they're standing. He was quiet. That's what a partnership is, she said. It came out simpler than she'd intended, stripped of any decoration, just the plain fact of it. That's all it is. I know, he said. I'm just not used to having one. Neither am I, she said. We're figuring it out at the same time. That seems fair. February brought a letter from Cincinnati. Her cousin had written back, 4 pages, which was more than Rosalie had expected, in the close handwriting of someone who had a lot to say and had been waiting for an invitation to say it. The letter was warm and genuine and contained family news that was mostly irrelevant to Rosalie's life in Wyoming, but that she read carefully anyway, because it was connection to something she'd been without for a long time. At the end of the 4th page, her cousin wrote, I always knew you'd find it, Rosalie, not because you were lucky. Lord knows luck was never your particular blessing, but because you never stopped being worth finding. I'm glad someone finally had the sense to see that. She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she folded the letter and put it in the tin box she kept on the bedroom shelf, the same box that held the envelope with Harlan Croft's 3 sentences, which she'd kept not as a wound but as a marker. The letter and the envelope in the same box. The distance between them was the distance she'd traveled. She wrote back to her cousin that week. She told her about the ranch in more detail than the first letter, about Clara and Ernesto and Pete. She told her about the fire and the Kessler build and the preserves operation, which had, by February, developed into a consistent arrangement with 3 neighboring ranches and a small establishment in Millhaven that sold provisions. She told her she was learning what it meant to build a life in a place rather than a life in opposition to a place, which was different from anything she'd done before and harder in some ways and better in most. She told her cousin that she'd been wrong about what she was eligible for, that the wrong had been in her, not in the facts, because the facts had always been that she was capable and determined and worth something. She'd just spent so long accepting other people's accounting of her worth that she'd started doing their math for them. That was the thing she came back to in the long Wyoming winter evenings when the work was done and the house was quiet and Cole was reading or mending something and she was at the table with whatever needed doing. She came back to the math, to who had taught it to her and why she'd been a willing student for so long. She didn't have clean answers. She didn't think clean answers were honest. What she had was the evidence of 5 months of doing work that mattered and being seen doing it, which had not erased the years before but had put something solid on the other side of the scale. You couldn't undo what had been done to you, but you could, it turned out, outlast it. You could accumulate a different kind of evidence and let that become the louder story. Spring announced itself in the particular way of Wyoming springs, which was not gently. It came in with mud and flooding on the South Creek and a week of wind that pushed through every gap in the ranch buildings with cheerful malice. And then, abruptly, a morning in late March when the air smelled different, like something opening, and the first green appeared at the garden edge, a volunteer from last year's seeds that had survived the winter in the soil. Rosalie found it on a Thursday morning and crouched down to look at it, and stayed there longer than she'd planned, thinking about the woman who'd planted the seeds in August, how afraid she'd been underneath the work, how much energy she'd spent carrying the fear quietly so it wouldn't slow her down. She thought about what she'd have told that woman, if she could have. She thought she'd have told her, the fear is reasonable, and it's also lying to you. Not about everything. The fear that said people would be cruel, that was accurate. The fear that said the cruelty would win, that was wrong. The fear that said she wasn't worth fighting for, that was the worst lie, and the most practiced, and the hardest to stop believing. You had to be shown differently. That was the hard truth. Some things you couldn't argue yourself into from the inside. Someone had to show up and behave differently than everyone who'd come before, and you had to be brave enough to believe the evidence when it arrived. Cole had shown up. That was luck, and she didn't diminish it. It was luck in the same way that a rope thrown to a drowning person is luck, real and necessary, and not the whole story. The rest of the story was that she'd been swimming hard enough to still be there when the rope arrived. You couldn't receive what you'd already sunk past. She'd been swimming, for years. Badly, some of them. But she hadn't stopped. She stood up from the volunteer seedling and went back inside because the morning had things in it that needed doing, and spring was going to require a replanting plan by the end of the week. The preserve's business had grown by spring into something that required more formal management than she'd set up the previous fall. The arrangement with the Millhaven merchant, a man named Calloway, who'd taken the preserves on consignment in October and by February was asking for twice the volume, had developed to the point where she needed either to scale up significantly or to define what the operation's actual limit was. She talked to Cole about it on a March evening, the ledger open between them as it always was. If I take Calloway's full spring order, I need more jars, more produce, and 2 more days a week that I don't currently have, she said. Which means either I do less of something else or I bring someone in to help. Who? He said. Mrs. Kessler said something to me in February about looking for work, she said. Her husband's operation isn't fully back to where it was before the fire. She's practical and capable, and I already know she works hard. Cole looked at the ledger. What does it do to the margin? I ran it. She turned the ledger toward him. If I pay her a fair day rate and fill Calloway's order, I net more than I currently make selling smaller volume. The math works. He read through what she'd written. He asked 2 questions. She answered them. He nodded. Do it, he said. She wrote to Mrs. Kessler the next day. The answer came back in a week. Yes. They started in April, when the garden was going in. Hannah Kessler was quiet, steady, and had a better instinct for fruit preserves than Rosalie did, which Rosalie acknowledged without difficulty and incorporated into their process. They worked together 2 days a week through spring and into summer, and the Calloway order was filled on time. And by July, Calloway had mentioned them to a merchant in the next county who wrote to inquire about supply. She mentioned the inquiry to Cole over supper on a Thursday night in July, almost exactly 1 year after the road. He looked at her across the table. What do you want to do with it? She thought about it. Not for long, she'd been thinking about it since the letter arrived, which was her way. I want to answer it carefully, she said, and find out what the volume looks like, and then decide. That's sensible, he said. I'm a sensible person, she said. You're the most sensible person I know, he said, and then paused, and also the most stubborn, which is a different thing. They're related, she said. I know, he said. I think that's why they work. Pete, who was at the end of the table eating with the concentration that meant he'd been working hard all day, looked up and said, Are you two going to argue, or can I have more of the beans? Take the beans, Rosalie said. He took them. The summer was hard, in the way Wyoming summers were always hard. The drought came back in June and required the irrigation management she'd refined from the previous year. The cattle operation had a disease scare in the east pasture that cost them 2 weeks of intensive management, and the fence? Ernesto had flagged in November required an emergency repair after a spring storm made its condition critical. None of it broke them. That was the difference from the previous year, and she knew it, and she didn't take it for granted. What she noticed, moving through that second summer, was how much the ranch had changed in the way people treated it. Ranchers who'd driven past Cole's property with the vague pity of neighbors watching a struggling operation now stopped at the fence to talk. The feed supplier had renegotiated after Cole's approach in the fall. She'd given him the talking points, he'd made the argument, they'd met in the middle at a price that was fair, and the relationship had improved rather than broken. Decker had paid back his $60 in one sum in April, without discussion, which Cole had reported with the flat factual delivery of someone choosing not to make anything of it, and Rosalie had chosen not to make anything of it either. The thing about Sarah Bellhurst resolved itself not through a confrontation, but through time and the specific awkwardness of evidence. By summer of the second year, the meeting Sarah had organized at the Orville house had become something no one mentioned in Rosalie's presence, not because it had been forgotten, but because the terms it had operated on, that Rosalie was an improper presence, a problem, a temporary complication, had been so thoroughly overtaken by events that mentioning it required acknowledging how badly the assessment had aged. Sarah Bellhurst was not a cruel person, Rosalie had concluded. She was a frightened person who used cruelty as a tool when she felt uncertain. The difference mattered, even if the behavior was the same. At the July 4th gathering in Mill Haven, the county's annual outdoor celebration, held on the flat ground east of town, Sarah Bellhurst walked over to where Rosalie was standing with Clara and said, without preamble, "The pickles you put up last fall, the ones Calloway had in the store, I bought 3 jars." Rosalie looked at her. "I hope they were good." "They were," Sarah said. A pause. "I wanted you to know." She walked away. Clara watched her go. "That's as close to an apology as Sarah Bellhurst gets," Clara said. "I know," Rosalie said. "I'll take it." She did take it. Not because the summer at the well had stopped being what it was, but because she understood, at 30 years old and 1 year into a life she'd built from a road and a stranger's decency, that you didn't get to choose what other people had done. You only got to choose what you did with where you were standing after. She'd done something with it. That was enough. It was Pete who asked her, on a late July evening when they were both in the yard watching the light go out of the sky, what she would have done if Cole hadn't stopped on the road. She thought about it honestly. Pete deserved honest answers. He always had. "I don't know," she said. "Figured something out. I'm not good at not figuring something out." "But it wouldn't have been this," he said. "No," she said. "It wouldn't have been this." He was quiet for a moment. He'd grown up some over the year. Still a talker, still artless, but less naive in the specific way that came from watching people you respected do hard things and succeed at them only partially and keep going anyway. "Does it scare you?" How close it was to not happening. She looked at the last of the light on the horizon. "It used to," she said, "when I thought about it in the first months. The smallness of it. That everything changed because one man stopped his horse." She paused. "But I've decided that's the wrong way to see it." "What's the right way?" "The right way is that it happened because of what both of us were," she said. "He stopped because he's the kind of person who stops. I stayed because I'm the kind of person who works with what's in front of her. If either of us had been different people, the moment wouldn't have mattered." She looked at Pete. "The miracle isn't the coincidence. It's the character. That's what makes the coincidence into something." Pete sat with that for a while, the way he sat with things he was genuinely thinking about, which was how you could tell them apart from the things he was just letting pass through. "That's smart," he said finally. "Thank you, Pete. I mean it. That's a real thing." "I know you mean it," she said. "You always mean things. It's one of your best qualities." He looked pleased and slightly embarrassed, which was his standard response to a compliment delivered directly. She'd learned to deliver them directly anyway because he needed to get used to it. Cole came out of the barn and stood at the yard's edge, looking at the same sky they were looking at. He did this sometimes in the evenings, came out to look at the day's end without making a project of it. She watched him for a moment. He looked across the yard and met her eyes. He didn't wave or gesture, just looked, the way he'd been looking at her for a year with that steady, complete attention that still settled her chest in a way she'd stopped analyzing. She looked back the same way. Pete, watching this exchange with the unself-consciousness of someone who'd grown up around it, stood up and stretched and said, "I'm going to go check on the horses," which was what Pete said when he determined he was a third person in a moment that only needed 2. He went. Cole came across the yard and stood beside her. He looked at the last thin line of orange above the western plain. "Good day," he said. "Yes," she said. They stood there together in the quiet of a summer evening on a ranch that was doing better than it had the year before, which was doing better than it had the year before that, which was not a coincidence and not just luck and not the achievement of any single decision, but the accumulation of a year's worth of daily ones, small and large, brave and ordinary, made together and separately and in the spaces between. She thought about the gate, about the envelope in the tin box on the bedroom shelf and the letter beside it, about the road in July heat, and a lean cowboy on a horse who had asked practical questions and answered a moral one. She thought about the ledger and the flue and the jars lined up on the cooling surface, and Alice Dempsey talking to the frightened horses in a smoke-filled yard. She thought about what she'd told Pete. The miracle isn't the coincidence, it's the character. She believed that. She believed it the way she believed the numbers in the ledger, because she'd checked it from multiple angles and it held. The character had always been there. In her. In Cole. Waiting for the conditions that would let it become what it was capable of being. The road had been the conditions. The gate, the envelope, the laughter in that July yard. All of it had been the conditions. Terrible conditions that had opened into something she hadn't known how to want. She'd been abandoned at a gate and found her way to the one place that had ever felt like home. Not because the place was perfect, it wasn't, and neither were the people in it, including her. But because the people in it had decided to see each other clearly and then decided to stay anyway, and that was the whole of it. That was what love was, stripped of decoration, seeing clearly and choosing to remain. The last light left the sky. The stars came out, the Wyoming stars that still surprised her sometimes with their number and their indifference and their beauty, and she stood beside the man who had stopped his horse on a July road and changed the direction of her life. And she felt, not happiness as a constant state, which was not a real thing, but something more durable. Rootedness. The specific piece of someone who has found their ground and knows it. "Rosalie," Cole said, "What are you thinking about?" She looked at the stars. Thought about it. "The gate," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I used to think that was the worst day of my life," she said. "I thought that for months, even after everything started getting better. I'd think about standing there with that envelope and feel it all over again." "And now?" he said. She looked at him, at his face in the dark, honest and tired and present. "Now I think it was the day I had to have," she said. "Not because the suffering was worth it. I don't believe that. But because it put me on the road at the right moment, in front of the right person, and I was still standing when it mattered." She looked back at the stars. "I didn't need saving. I needed someone to see me. There's a difference." He didn't answer right away. He thought about it the way he thought about things he took seriously. "I saw you," he said finally. "I know," she said. That was everything. The night settled around them, large and quiet and full of the ordinary sounds of a working ranch going to sleep. The horses, the cattle in the far pasture, the wind across the grass. She had been standing at a gate in July heat, not knowing where her next meal was coming from or who she was to anyone in this territory. She was home now. Not the home she'd been sent toward, the one in the letter with its 3 sentences that had tried to define her value in a single dismissive sweep. Not the home she'd imagined from Ohio, which had been more like a transaction than a life. This home, the imperfect, demanding, genuinely hers home that she'd built from the ground up with her hands and her stubbornness and the unexpected luck of a man with enough character to stop. She had built herself a life, not the life she'd been told she was eligible for, the one she'd actually wanted, that she hadn't known she was allowed to want, that had been waiting, it turned out, not for her to be different, but for her to stop accepting other people's measurements as accurate. That was the lesson she carried. Not that things worked out in the end, because they didn't always, and she knew it, but that your worth was not a consensus. It was not determined by the people who looked at you and saw only the surface. It existed independently of whether anyone had the vision to recognize it, and all you could do, all you were responsible for doing, was keep moving toward the light and stay standing until someone with clear eyes finally arrived. She had stayed standing. The rest had followed. Above her, the Wyoming stars burned cold and vast and permanent, and Rosalie Maddox stood under them with her ground beneath her feet and her life built around her and the people she loved close enough to hear, and she did not waste the moment by wishing it into anything other than exactly what it was.